when we connected, it was just so easy. I just sort of just fired off an email one day, and I'm so glad I did. It's been a lot of fun, guys.
Welcome to the Product Quest podcast. Thank you for joining us on a journey to better understand innovation and product strategy. My name is Jan Vermut, and joining me as always, my co-hosts Jonathan Edwards and Scott Burleson. Today is a special episode. We look back on this crazy podcast project we launched in March this year. I mean, we produced 30 episodes, and just recently, by the way, we crossed more than 3,000 all-time downloads. So that's something to celebrate for us here. So today we'll look back and discuss the insights each of us took away from our 20 awesome guests so far. So if you're looking for a shortcut, this is your episode. But of course, we will also dive into everything else that makes the job of running a podcast fun. The format will be that we quickly present one of our guests that we had on the podcast, discuss the key insights each of us took away from the session, and then move on to the next one. So let's dive right in. We kicked off the year with Ruth Hartt. She applies jobs to be done in the arts space. So she has a background in opera. I think she's an opera singer herself, then worked at the Christensen Institute as chief of staff, and is now bringing through various ways and mostly through her blog, the jobs to be done perspective and lens to the art space. And for me, so I'm just going to start this off. I really enjoyed kicking it off with her. I mean, it showed kind of that in some sense, and maybe that's an exaggeration, jobs to be done really doesn't have limits. It's so nice to suddenly see. I mean, I've been in this field for 10 years, and suddenly from a very, very different industry in brackets, somebody comes and just applies it in a space I would never have thought that it could bring value. So it really proves this point that we've been discussing, I think, throughout the year, that it's jobs to be done is like glasses that you put on, but you can never take back off. Once you have them, once you kind of get in touch with it, you don't lose that lens anymore. And Ruth, I think, using it in arts and how opera positions themselves and how the arts in general can reposition themselves to be more audience focused is kind of a proof of that fact. So jobs to be done as a lens that you cannot take off. That for me was kind of the key insight I took away from her. Of course, there was a lot about opera and the job of music and everything like that. So that was we can maybe dive into that a little bit deeper. But that's for me kind of the very great starting point that we had in this year. What do you guys think?
By the way, I have to say, Jan, I've stolen one of your metaphors.
Good.
Used it's very common to use the lens. You see the lens, you see the world differently. But in some of your LinkedIn posts, some of your communications, you use the metaphor back from the Matrix movie, the blue pill versus the red pill. And you can take the blue pill and you can continue to be deceived by whatever the world of products and technologies. You take the red pill and you start to see things as they really are. I'm just telling you, I've absolutely stolen that and have been using.
Good, I like it.
But with Ruth, she was our first guest. She was wonderful. And if I think back over the year, I was probably the most nervous before that one.
Me too.
Than any other ones. We did one with just us, I was nervous for that too, but I was the most nervous for Ruth. All of a sudden we had to figure out, like, we knew what we were doing, and she was wonderful. She was just absolutely wonderful. And to your point, it is really interesting to see people from different backgrounds. What's the more common path is somebody was an engineer, then they're a product manager, and that's sort of the more common path. But Ruth coming from the arts and a very accomplished opera singer, and I'm amazed at the knowledge that is in her head for understanding music, something she's done her whole life, and she sees she very clearly sees how jobs you've done thinking can be used in promoting the arts as a business. And one of the things that jumps out at me is no matter what your business is or your technology is, you become very enthusiastic about it. If it's electrical stuff, if it's software, if it's cars, or if it's whatever, and then you very quick, because you're excited about it, you
Yeah.
you very quickly assume, well, everybody's excited about it. And so in the arts, there's nobody's immune. Nobody's immune from this. So in the arts, you're also not immune. But so now it's like, well, because it's wonderful music, because it's this, because the composer has all these credentials, but Ruth is using jobs to be done. But like, wait, let's look at this through the eyes of somebody who wants to enjoy it, enjoy the music, or might see a night at the opera as something they would do. And with the jobs we've done lens, well, what else are they competing with? Well, they're competing with Netflix. Well, they're not just competing with another opera singer or even another concert. They're competing with however somebody would entertain themselves. And she's taken that red pill, and you can tell, and she's got a lot of enthusiasm, excitement. But I mean, it was wonderful to hear that from her perspective, but just on a personal level, she was just delightful. We could have talked to Ruth. She's somebody I could just listen. I mean, it's just like, I know we're just scratching the surface. She had a lot to share. And again, as our first guest, Ruth, thank you so much. It was you really helped us to get, you really eased the path for us to get started on this trip.
Yeah.
I'll totally second that. I think we couldn't have wished for a better first guest, as she was very good at expressing herself and very, I thought, came across really well. And I definitely was very nervous too. And what I found quite fascinating with Ruth is the one topic we've discussed quite often is this this fact that some people are naturally drawn to approaches like jobs to be done, and other people are not so drawn. And in my experience, I've noticed people who are more on the engineering side will be drawn to this kind of way of thinking, and people who are more artistic, maybe a bit less. And I thought it was quite fascinating that you have a true artist who also had this interest, more than an interest, I mean, this passion for jobs to be done. I thought that was quite an interesting combination.
Yeah, I like that you said it. I mean, I totally agree with you that there is that is more kind of artsy designer space usually, that is they've the reproach that comes very often towards jobs one is, oh, that's so rational, so technical, so like, I don't know what, left brain, whatever, like one half of the brain. I think it's the left one, and that the reproach comes very often, and she kind of embraced it, and you can see how it's a very human thing. I mean, if you listen to the episode that we had with her, it's about escaping. It's about the mom that kind of wants to have one evening of relief from, and that these are all jobs. These are all valid jobs. But I think the examples that we often use are technical, but it's so lovely to see that it works in all of these more, well, yeah, more abstract, more also more generally human kinds of things that you can use it even in that space. So I really liked it. By the way, you can check her out on YouTube. I mean, I listened to her singing operas. There are clips for, you should absolutely do this. It's lovely.
Yeah, something just occurs to me now. Back to the, if you work in we're not a jobs to be done themed podcast per se. It just happens we have a lot of interest in it, and it's going to come up a lot. It's just sort of how we see the world. But when in jobs to be done, if you talk about it to any degree, eventually you'll bring up the 1960s Ted Levitt article, Marking Myopia. And in there, he didn't use the words jobs to be done, but he very much described this idea of separating solution from benefits. But one of his examples was the movie industry. And he said people in the movie industry, they shouldn't see themselves in the movie industry, but in the business of entertainment. And here, what's
You're
this,
so
50,
right.
60 years later, we have Ruth, and it's not the business of the opera. It's also the business of entertainment.
You're right.
So I think, Jan, you prepared an insight and a question you might have wanted to ask Ruth and a quote. Shall we move on to that?
Sure. I mean, we can also maybe move on. I mean, I don't think we have to follow this all the time, but what I want to bring up is really the quote. I mean, the quote, I think you, Scott, you mentioned this, where you mentioned, well, like the question came up in the arts space, like who is the opera competing with? And it's not just another opera. And we had that quick discussion where I think I talked about the chocolate project that we have. And then basically from the discussion, we realized that on some level, chocolate and opera compete. So it was this, I mean, we had this project on chocolate where we realized there is the chocolate bit in the evening is also a form of escapism. And I think she mentioned an opera that had just saying like escape from your everyday struggle or something like that. That's kind of the selling line or the tagline for an opera. And then I think there was this, so she asked me, so you're saying chocolate and opera compete on the job of escaping? And then of course I said yes, and she loved that immediately. So I think that's really goes back to the point that you mentioned, Scott, in the beginning, where through that lens you suddenly realize who are you really competing with, and then also what's the language that you need to use in order kind of to win against those competitive products like chocolate or a glass of wine or whatever it is in the evening that get to that escape. So I think that's just a wonderful quote. But what I would have asked her if she would be here now is, I mean, I think we had that discussion a little bit, and maybe you brought this up, Jonathan, but it's one thing to say, okay, how do you communicate as an opera towards your customers, and how can you do that more audience focused? But what would it mean to make opera itself, like the thing you sing, the thing you perform, more audience focused? Would that actually be something that you would want to do? Or is art something that kind of inherently also needs to go against kind of what the audience wants in a certain sense? But very often new pieces of music and so on, they're not accepted at first. So I would be really interested to kind of figure out, where is there a line somewhere where audience focus is even like counterproductive in the production of arts or something like that?
You know, one thing I remember from the conversation, so a lot of it we were talking about how he used sort of jobs we've done thinking from accessing a broader audience. But she was very quick to also say this is not about dumbing it down. It's not about So it's not necessarily, I mean, it's not necessarily about taking an Italian opera, now it's making it in English. It's funny, when we were warming up, we were just sort of chatting. We talked about how languages, when you know, it's lost in translation. I mean, a word moved to another language, it gives you the idea, but there's something different. I'm not an expert in opera, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say if you translate the Italian operas and the German operas into English, that there'll be a lot. I would say you probably lose a lot. I mean, there's a reason why people, want to read ancient Hebrew text in Hebrew. They want to read Greek text in Greek because they want to understand that directly. But so she was real clear about it was not about dumbing it down. And I'm sure there's in the practical sense of determining what component goes into a concert, if you want to make it more accessible, there's probably some judgment calls. Where in this performance do we need to stick strictly to what's the tradition? And that's what is, we don't want to lose that. But what can be altered a bit to make it more accessible? It's funny. It's as we're recording this, it's close to Christmas time. I remember I took my family once to see a presentation of the Christmas Carol here locally as a musical, and I was assuming it was the Christmas Carol, got kids there, but it was very much this sort of rock and roll version, and it wasn't what I wanted. I mean, it was fine. People liked it. Apparently, it was a big tradition of this show, and there's local performers had altered it. But I didn't want that. I wanted the more traditional presentation. I mean, it was fine. Again, it wasn't bad. But I remember very much her talking about it's not about dumbing down opera. But I have to imagine if you are thinking about, creating this opera product, there's some judgment calls there. Where do we hold to tradition? Because we're honoring this, I have no idea, this, this, I don't think it's probably an ancient's not the word, but hundreds, perhaps, certainly
yeah,
hundreds,
probably
certainly centuries
thousands.
old traditions.
Yeah.
Where do we, because that's something about what's so unique about it. And then where might we, throw in a little something to help the new person appreciate it a little bit, maybe as a little bit of a gateway drug to it, if you will.
Yeah. Very nice. So should we move on?
Let's do. Thank
Let's
you,
move on.
Ruth. You were wonderful. We could not have
Yes,
asked for a better
Thanks,
first
Ruth.
guest. You're fantastic.
Okay, so our the next guest. So we're not going to talk about our guests in the order of appearance on our podcast. So the next person we're going to talk about is Lance Bettencourt, who was, I think, episode 3 or 4, maybe. I think episode 4, actually. And so Lance is a professor of marketing, and he's also an author of the book Service Innovation. So he's an expert in service design. And he also notably invented or co-invented or was at the root of the customer job map. So with the job steps, which is one of the fundamental tools used in Jobs to be Done, and which was integrated further down the line by Tony Ulwick at Stratagen. And so except for the famous HBR article called the Customer-Centered Innovation Map that Lance and Tony Ulwick co-authored, I was not so familiar with Lance's work. I did read his book, Service Innovation, prior to us talking to him. And I mean, he was just such an open and, again, very generous guest with the information he gave us and making us feel at ease. Probably we should have made him feel at ease, but he definitely made us feel at ease. So that was very nice. And what I liked about this discussion was when we talked about so there were a few things. So the first thing is we talked about the value of qualitative research. We had an interesting discussion between Scott and Lance about the value of qualitative research that many people in Jobs to be Done will put forward the value of the quantitative aspect side of things, but that qualitative research is extremely useful. And I really enjoyed the comparisons between different tools that are used by different people in design and innovation, and comparing these tools. So comparing the job map to the service blueprinting and to the customer journey map. So there was an interesting discussion about the distinctions between these different tools. And I really liked, so as mentioned, we prepared some insights we got from each of our guests, a quote and a question we would have liked to ask. So I really liked the one quote from Lance, which was, "Activities themselves are solutions." And this is something I myself have often. So activities was in the context of customer journey maps. It's one of the ingredients, let's say, of customer journey maps. And activities are solutions is something I've often pondered about, and I thought it was a very nice kind of thing to make you think.
Yeah.
And so that's what I liked about that discussion. Don't know if you guys want to add something.
So I'm so sorry, Scott. I have to jump in. But I liked what you pointed out, Jonathan, because I think it's really worth an episode listening to, because I mean, he has such and I think you underestimate this in the beginning, but he has such a finesse for picking the right words. And it's really, I mean, and it's not just because, well, he likes to talk in a different way, but there's a lot of thought that went into how he phrases things. So I remember vividly the discussion we had about the word benefit. So he said, well, okay, some people, they say, well, jobs to be done is nothing else but, well, talking about the benefits. But then kind of, I think there was a 10 or 15-minute elaboration then from his side, how benefit actually is only thinkable as the benefit of a solution. So it's not a solution-free word. So, and all these kinds of like very, very tiny things that you need to rephrase are exactly the activities themselves are solutions. So the difference between activities. So I think a very well thought out language, and he kind of seems to be discovering these different kind of tracks where you need to use another word to stay in the problem or the jobs to be done space. So I like that really a lot. It sharpened my language as well, like how I phrase things.
Wow, I am impressed by your memory, Jan, I have to say.
Well, let's see how far it gets with the other guests.
Well, you can with Lance. I mean, what do you say? I mean, you're right, Jan. I mean, you can see why he would be a great outcome gatherer. I mean, you can imagine him interviewing a customer, getting that syntax exactly right for what it is. You know, you can see, wow, because he I don't know how to put this, but he's just very good with words. I mean, he uses the right word and he'll think about it, and each word is very intentionally chosen. But yeah, Lance, I mean, Lance, first of all, he's a good friend of mine. But he's also my mentor in this space. I mean, back years ago, we used to travel together. I mean, I would pick his brain and we would just talk. I mean, it's not like we were having lecturer or student time per se, but we would just have discussions and we would just talk about it. And even a long time ago, when I read What Customers Want, I was like, well, this is Tony Ulwick's book, What Customers Want. This describes a market research process, but this is more than that. There's a philosophy behind it, which has value all by itself. If you never did a research project, the value of thinking has value completely independent of if you do research. And Lance is a philosopher. I mean, I don't know if he thinks of himself. Well, Jan, you would be able to better lay that judgment on than me, but he thinks deeply about these things. Activities are solutions is a great example, you know, or relationships with your customers. Those relationships are part of the solution. It's like, what? Really? The relationship with the customer is part of the solution? You know, so, but because he thinks about these things deeply. And that's why, you know, I'm always like, I tell people, read everything Lance has ever written. Read everything. And it's just full of these, it's just full of this wisdom, if you will. He's very deliberate. He's very deliberate in his language. And I believe we owe him an ice cream also, as I recall.
Oh, that's true.
I'm not sure how he get that to Texas.
There was a lot around sugar and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, he stays in good shape. But then I see he always eats ice cream. Like, how does that work? But, you know, he's also, he's rare in a lot of ways in that, you know, you think about this, well, academics sort of make this common error and practitioners make this common error. Well, Lance has got extensive background in both. He's got lots of hours logged interviewing customers, analyzing data, and as a professor and as a writer. And so if you want to up your game in jobs to be done, I say it all the time, read everything Lance has ever written. He's a super dude on top of that.
Yeah. So one question I regret not asking Lance or not diving in a bit more into is one of these age-old questions that people debate, which is, what is the difference in approaching service and product innovation? I think we could have maybe talked a bit more about that with him, and I would look forward to discussing that with him at a later stage if he's open.
So this is an invite for 2023 that we will send out, but let's. I mean, I think he said he was willing to join again. So that's his fault.
He did. He did. It was for payment of ice cream. He was willing to come back.
Good.
Yeah.
We can arrange that.
Yeah.
So the next episode, Scott, I think you are presenting.
Yeah, Ronan Healy and Jane Hessian are a husband and wife team who they have a design consultancy called How Might We? And I loved this conversation. I've listened to this one a lot. I mean, they're all we learned something from everyone, but I've personally probably listened to this one more than any other. And there's a lot in this. So the sort of initial premise, is the power of play. So the main tools they use within their consulting practice is Lego serious play, and they work with corporations and innovation teams, and they've worked for the Irish government. So they've got a impressive list of clients, but they essentially have Legos where they build things and do things as part of a facilitated exercise. And so I expected to talk a lot about play, and we did talk a lot about play. I remember mentioning like my own girls had built a fairy garden in the yard. Like, what are they trying to accomplish? And I think that's part of the reason I found myself listening to it a lot is they have so much insight into the brain and what's going on when somebody is playing. And if you think about when we're at work now, I mean, we have things that are drudgery, and then we have things that are like play. And what's the difference in those two? And I found it fantastic. And so in Ronan, we had met a few times. We just had some web conferences. He reached out. We connected via LinkedIn, and then we just set up some web conferences. We would just sort of talk about innovation stuff. So I knew we had to have him on. But one of the things that they speak to is this idea of embodied cognition. But essentially it's like we think with our whole bodies, like with everything. It's not just our brain. You hear this brain gut connection as part of your brain, but the fact of actually tangibly using things with your hands is part of part of your thinking mechanism, part of your problems, the way you solve problems. And I want to listen to it again right now. Because it was really, I just feel like there's a lot more I can still learn.
It was a very joyful experience. Yeah,
it was fun. It was fun. Yeah.
And maybe so that's a question, but now you mentioned this embodied cognition thing. Are they maybe one other person I remember, but I think they were at least the first that both stood during our discussion. It's so natural. Everybody else sat down, sat at their table. I'm sitting right now, so we were all sitting. And they, I think, quite purposefully, they both stood while they went well. And I don't think that's that. So I think that was on purpose.
Yeah,
I think we had a few others. I think we had also Jan Schmiedgen. I think he was standing.
I was, maybe.
And I think Ian Kerr also was standing.
I think Mr. Joe was standing. I could be wrong.
Oh yes,
that could
possible.
be, or he just had a great setup.
Right, he had a great setup. Yeah.
But anyway, I'm sorry.
It was just one of my favorites. I mean, I'm not going to say a favorite, but I'll say one of them. I don't know. I just found them delightful to listen to, and I feel like a lot to learn from. And it makes sense that their area would be about play but not necessarily fun. Like they would describe, well, what's the difference in these deliberate Lego exercises as opposed to riding a roller coaster? Riding a roller coaster is fun, but there's really nothing transformative about it. Like you're not. Yeah. It's just some of it's the lowest level of entertainment. I mean, it's like you pick up a 2-year-old, you sling them around, and that's fun. But there's no transformation. There's nothing changed, and so I thought that was an important distinction between playing and having fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Ronan, at least the way I remember it, I think she has a PhD as well. I mean, they're extremely well read. I think it was one of the episodes I took most of the books away from. So I think Antonio Damasio, that was one of the names that came up.
Yes.
If I remember correctly, like this it was Descartes' Error, I think.
That's right.
And as a philosopher, I mean, that's a book you have to read.
That's right.
So I really like this. It's an extremely thought-provoking episode, and I think they're quick thinkers. They connect a lot of different things. So hugely entertaining thing to listen to.
I can tell you if I was in a corporate situation and had a team, or I wanted some folks to be better at working together, if we had something we were trying to bust through, I would be reaching out to How Might We and get their thoughts on it and think about working with them. I would highly recommend. I would be very interested in that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was extremely impressed also by you hear Lego and you think of children and something quite simple and playing and not necessarily that deep, but I mean the thought that they've put behind their work is truly astounding. They've really thought very deeply about these things, read extensively. There's a whole world behind the Legos, and I thought it was also extremely and interesting. And they're both very animated in how they talk about their topic, very passionate. So I enjoyed that episode a lot too.
Yeah. I mean, I think it probably was the next one, or it was the one before. I don't know. But Indi Young. So talking about passion, I felt like the episode with Indi Young, she was. I mean, I think that is one of the episodes I also enjoyed so deeply, because I mean you could really feel the wealth of experience that she's talking from. So am I right? So yeah, let's jump over to Indi Young. I mean, she has, I think it's mainly focused on qualitative research, but not exclusively. But she's a qualitative researcher. I think in San Francisco, if I'm not mistaken, but probably works all over like we all do. And probably best known for the phrase mental models. I think that is what she invented. And now I think her latest book is Time to Listen, is the latest book that she put out. And it's about how you actually, understand human beings and how you talk to them, and how listening is such an important feature in all our innovation and strategy efforts. So, I mean, I was just hugely impressed by the delicacy or the finesse that she had, the well thought out way of how she does qualitative research. I mean, she called these listening sessions, so that already is a different frame. And it's such, I mean, listening sessions take the time they take, like whatever that means. It can be short, can be long. I think she does one of them per day or two, maybe something like that. So it's not, and it's really, I felt like. So when we do this, we say, okay, we do 4, maybe 5 or 6 interviews per day. We have a clear schedule. We jump from one to one. We have some air in between. And her approach was, I felt like it's much, much more open. You can go very different ways, and you're really listening to the person and going with whatever the interview is saying and whatever comes up. And it's not just, and that's, I think, the beauty of her approach. And it's not just, you get lost in whatever, but somehow this is all connectable and usable later on in her approach to actually build some innovations that solve customer problems. She used the language of it helps them make progress toward the purpose. I think that is kind of the language that she used. And I was just, I mean, hugely impressed by the depth of thinking that went into how she does qualitative interviews.
I just love the commitment to qualitative, and I'm a complete believer in it. I mean, quantitative obviously has its place, and there's a lot of value there. But for all the talk of data analysis and all this stuff, you know what? I have no problem acting on a great qualitative work. If you do the quantitative and you learn something completely new you didn't hear in qualitative, I'd question your survey. I'd say something's gone wrong there, because our brains are imperfect, because of confirmation bias and all sorts of things. But that's where Indi has, she works hard at this listing. She works hard at stripping her bias out. That's all any of us can do. But that's the biggest thing I took away from it is a couple of things. One is just believe in qualitative, and qualitative can be enough. And that's an opinion.
Yeah.
I don't know that I'm right, but it's a position that I share with her, that qualitative can be enough. The other thing is just almost more of a human thing. There's just a kindness to her. I mean, if she was interviewing me, I think I would tell her everything.
You just stole what I was going to say. I was just going to talk about that. No, totally. I mean, I second everything you say, Scott. I also really enjoyed this focus on qualitative. And she at some point, I don't have the exact quote, but she said something to the effect of that if you design for the average user, you're harming people, and that's just to show the level of commitment to doing of her values, basically. I think of not doing harm to people and trying to make the world a better place for everyone. She also introduced, I thought, an interesting new concept, which is the strategy space. She talked about there's the problem space, solution space, and strategy space, which I think is also talks about in her books. And also someone who really was a joy to listen to, just because she expressed herself so well and has something to say that's important.
I think she's really mastered this art of creating. I mean, it's all these kind of different words, but it's creating a space that you feel comfortable just sharing whatever with her. So that's I completely agree. And for me, it's so the one of the key distinctions, maybe that's one of those biases, kind of the discussions that we had yesterday are more important than discussions we had later on. But I had a discussion yesterday. And I would, maybe we go off topic here too much, but I have a hypothesis that if we talk about from a jobs to be done perspective about being solution free, there's a lot of people that misunderstand solution free and that are not really, I think solution agnostic would be a better term. So because solution free is something like, well, you can be solution free in a sense where you say, okay, I'm open to whichever way the idea then in the final form goes. And that people believe is solution free, but I think it's not. But solution agnostic will be maybe more powerful in the sense of, I don't even know or care about the solution yet. So, and I think she had this very deliberate way of distinguishing problem space, solution space, and in between is the strategy space. And that for me just made it so clear how everything fits together. And I liked her emphasis on the problem space. And I feel like still that is, I feel like solution free or problem space is in danger of becoming just a phrase everybody uses and just do the same things that they've always done before. Anyway, so that's my own rant or whatever.
The one thing that also I remember is, and I don't remember the details about it, but in her qualitative work, there's a quiet, and I'm not going to have her terminology exactly right, but it's there's quite a bit of work to understand the patterns. Like she's recognizing patterns to draw these conclusions, and I would love to see what that process is like. I mean, I think when any of us that do qualitative work, we're always, to some degree, we're doing that. We're looking for patterns, but she had a real, perhaps because there's not a quantitative phase, there was a real, I don't know, there was that, we didn't get in a lot of details on that, but I'd love to know what that process is like of finding patterns, validating. I mean, you do an interview, you get a certain perspective, you do another one, some things are reinforced, and then there's something that is in conflict, so as you personally, as I'm doing this, I have this recency bias. Like the one I did today seems to be those conclusions are a bit bigger in my mind than one I did 10 days ago. So how do you keep that in balance, the 10 days ago versus the one for today? How do you address the recency bias of a qualitative interviewer? We didn't get into that much nuts and bolts, but I would I would suspect she has a solution for it.
Yeah. All right, shall we move on?
Let's move on. So, the next guest we're gonna present is Jim Kalbach, who is a very well-known name in the jobs to be done space. And Jim Kalbach, I have to say, I think that's one of my favorite episodes. I would totally recommend it as a first episode to listen to for anyone who wants to know more about jobs to be done and who wants to get the basics, because we cover absolutely everything in that episode, I think. And it was really amazing. I think all the important topics were covered, and Jim is also someone who is very used to explaining and facilitating, getting people on board. So he's also very good at presenting the ideas in an entertaining and very knowledgeable way. So I think one insight I really got out from there, even though I think it's hard to get really new insights on jobs to be done, given just the amount of time we spend talking about it. But I think one insight I got from Jim for me was this notion that jobs to be done separates it sounds obvious now when you said, but he said it in a really nice way, that you separate the metrics and the job. So he said typically in design thinking or in other approaches, you would mix up the metrics with the function or the job you're trying to achieve. So yeah, he gives one example, which is find cheap airfares quickly. And this is how people might express a job, but this is not correct, or not correct in the job from the jobs to be done perspective, because you're mixing up the job, which is to find airfares, and the metrics that you use to measure the how well the job is done, which is, well, cheaply and quickly. And I thought that was, you just explained it in a really nice way. And I mean, we touched on so many different things. We also talked about why designers often push back against jobs to be done. I really liked also his focus on using all the tools he uses. He's someone who's really good at bringing together lots of different techniques and making them work for himself, and getting the best out of each of the tools and techniques. And I think his focus is always alignment, and I think he's very clear on that. And I thought that was also an interesting insight, that it's really about alignment. So getting people to communicate, to be on the same page. And as he says, one of his quotes in the episode is, it's not the map, it's the mapping. It's not the noun, it's the verb. And I really like that quote also. So it's about, it's the process of doing the work that actually where the most of the value lies, not only in the result. So anyway,
I think if I remember this correctly, I think he used this expression a couple of times. And now that you're saying this, it makes me think of that, where he says, well, now that we have the job map, so let's say we did a job map, or maybe in a workshop, whatever, now we can have better conversations. I think he several times he used this expression, the goal is having better conversations. And it reminded me so much when he talked about this alignment topic, that he's really coming from, I have a scattered team, they do different things, they use different approaches. So how can you kind of bring them together and have aligned conversations that are more precise, that have a more clear structure, and that really then kind of, and he uses different ways, and jobs to be done seems to be something that is doing the job quite well of having those better conversations that are more structured, more to the point, more really also probably in the user perspective. So I really like that as well. That's true. He and I think his book shows this as well, is it's about bringing things and people together, right? So that kind of connecting the different things, and it's a perfect example of American pragmatism, like taking everything where it is and just building your thing so that it works. So I really liked it as well.
American pragmatism. I don't know that I've heard that phrase, but that sounds like a good thing. But with Jim's, practical comes to mind. That was sort of one of I was thinking, because his book is like, let's get going. This is the plays book. These are the things you do. Let's get started. Let's get working together. And I think that's one of the things I love about it. Another thing is, it's probably the only book I know of that brings a lot of different jobs done perspectives together all in one place. Most he speaks of Ulwick, but also Moesta and other jobs done folks. Obviously Christensen and Bettencourt, but he sort of brings them all together. And he used a phrase that I've copied myself, because I think of myself this way too. He says, I might have this messed up a little bit, but something to the effect, I'm not necessarily an innovator, but I'm a curator. And I say the same about myself, in that he's a curator. He's finding things and bringing them all together. And that's probably, it's always a tough question. What would you start reading? Normally I recommend what customers want is what I recommend people going to, but to get a bigger understanding of all the other different thinkers sort of all in one place, his book is the Jobs Done Playbook is probably the only one. I would say the best one, but it's probably the only one that has these multiple perspectives all there together.
It's comprehensive. It really because there are a lot of different branches in jobs to be done, different people saying different things, and he really tries to bring everything together without judgment, and just saying, okay, what's good about this, good about that, and I think that's really, really useful. And I think on this episode also, as I was saying before, we discuss a lot of the kind of first questions you have when you learn about jobs to be done. And we also spend quite a bit of time talking about what can you focus on if you're not a big company. This is a criticism jobs to be done gets a lot, that it's too heavy, it's a heavy process, and if you're a startup you can't do it, etc. And we actually talk about that quite a lot. And he's really pragmatic, as you nicely said, Jan. He really goes into the details of saying, first you should do a job map, then you do this, and I thought there's some great insight in the whole conversation. So I'd really recommend anyone starting out with jobs to be done and others to listen to that one maybe first.
There is also, if you really want to have clarity about jobs, man, there's some guy that wrote a great book. It's called The Statue in the Stone. I don't know if you know it, Scott.
Oh, right.
Right. Yeah. That's a great one. I would really recommend as well as a starting point.
I definitely recommend that book.
Against all the confusion that you might have about jobs to be done, there is the perfect remedy. It's The Statue in the Stone. It's one of the best books about
I think the
jobs.
guy's called Scott, I think.
Scott something with a B. I don't know exactly what.
Yeah. But it's funny. It occurs to me here at our year end, we didn't really tell our origin story of how we got together, which really, it was really through that. But maybe we can. That's something we can get around to in a bit.
Yeah.
What was I going to say about Jim? Oh, so the job map. He uses the job map as sort of the core process of his training. So in the training, most of a lot of times jobs done training, it more begins with sort of just background and Levitt and Christensen, but he gets people started. Let's learn how to build a job map. That's that good old American pragmatism. But I sort of like that. It's like, whoa, let's get started. What's step 1, step 2, step 3? And I'm like, wow, what an innovative way to teach that. I just to me, like the background seems important, and it is, but I'm like, wow, what a novel approach. Just get started. And then along the way, a job step is also a job, a solution agnostic. So you can sort of teach it as you build the job map. And I will say this, in every now and then I'll be asked to teach, just like at a university, like 1 hour lecture or something. And I'll do that. And now when I do the job mapping part of it, that almost always pulls people in. And so more so than me going on about the background. So I think with Jim, the theme we keep coming to is practical, and it gets folks working and to see the connection of what's step one, step two. One of the criticisms of the field of statistics is that it's a big set of tools. Let me just take this big box of tools and just throw it at you. Just like, what do I do? What am I? It's the opposite of jobs we've done. What am I even trying to do here? You just throw all these tests at me. Just this box of statistical tests, you dumped them on my head. And now, I feel bad because it feels abstract and I can't understand. And so he takes the opposite approach. Instead of dumping all the tools on your head, hey, let's roll up our sleeves and get started. Let's build a job. Oh, by the way, this is what a job step is. Oh, when we're building a job map, this is what we're trying to do. Oh, beneath each step, we could have outcomes of how we define how well each of these is done. Oh, also there's these related jobs in addition to this too. So I wonder. So I don't have the question to ask him, but if I was going to ask a question, it would be, where did that insight come from to begin with the job map? For most of us that have taught it, that seems to be something that's in the middle of the course as opposed to the course. And so I found that to be very innovative. But Jim comes from, we described a typical path. The engineer becomes a product manager, is maybe a typical path. I don't know. But Jim's path is as a designer and as a user experience person. And so maybe, by the way, it's a community that designers are often the ones that don't are a little skeptical of jobs you've done. Doesn't feel practical enough. It feels too abstract. They're ready to get started doing something. So maybe that background as a designer helped him to, really see, just to get started. Like good old American pragmatism. I'm gonna use that. I see you pick that. I'm gonna use that phrase now.
Yeah. So by the way, maybe here shout out is in place. I mean, there's just his jobs to be done Untangled. I think he does something once a month or so, which is completely open session, Zoom session. It's really helpful. You can ask all your questions. He has a jobs to be done Untangled, and I think the jobs to be done toolkit is the website. So check that out. It's really helpful.
Yeah, if you follow Jim on LinkedIn, you'll see those announcements. And one of the things I really like about Jim is there's lots of things, but regarding jobs to be done, is he really does embrace all these sort of different schools of thoughts within it. And even though I have a position, I have things that I'm comfortable with, I stop short of saying that's the way to do things. I don't know how. I don't know. And so with Jim, wow, that's a great place he's a great person to learn from, because he's got this just a better, higher level perspective of he sees the good in lots of things. Lots of different perspectives. And
so maybe this aspect of teaching and how do you get people to learn something, I feel like that's a great kind of gateway over to Dan. I mean, Dan Adams, he was on, is he the founder of the AIM Institute?
That's right. Yeah. So I worked for Dan at the AIM Institute, and Dan created the new product blueprinting process, which is it's a qualitative and a quantitative voice of customer method, similar to what we're generally familiar with. That's his core product. And so he's the founder of the AIM Institute. That's right.
And I felt like for him, what I really saw is he must, I haven't had the chance to be in one of his courses or something, but I think he has been training a lot of people, and you can really feel his experience and how he must be one of the great teachers, I think. So he had this, I don't mean this in any way disrespectful. He had this kind of grandpa vibe that tells you a story, and suddenly after the story, you learn a couple of very insightful things that you can now use. So probably his trainings are a bit different, but he really had this. He really knew how to take you from a place where you don't know things and then feel uncomfortable to a place where you know things and feel comfortable. And he made all these difficult things, and it's difficult to understand this in the very beginning. He made it sound like I can get you there. So I really liked how he did that. I really liked the episode with him. There's so much in there from a standpoint that I find interesting. One of the most interesting things I think also this edition, well, one is the whole blueprinting approach, and that is really a software that you can use. There is a couple of other things that are really unique, I think. And then there is this very, very tiny detail that I remember quite vividly, how, for example, in a typical, if you so want, jobs based on study, in a sense, you get at one point this question of, okay, I now have an unmet need. I know it is not solved in the market, be that qualitatively or quantitatively, you now know this. But the question naturally comes up is, but well, how and how much do I need to improve the solution? Like, okay, it's unsolved, but if I improve the solution by X, will that already address the pain point or not? Or how, like, what exactly is the dimension of, because that's an open question. And I think he had this addition to the kind of question where he would ask this. So there is an additional part in, for example, if you do the quantitative part in the survey, where you would ask kind of to have hard numbers, if the product, of course, is suitable for these kinds of questions, but you would know by how much do you need to improve that product dimension in order to solve the problem. And I think that is, especially in the B2B context, which the AIM Institute, I think, is specialized in, it's extremely helpful, because you want to find that perfect point of, like, how much money do I basically, how much money or resources do I need to spend for improvement so that it exactly hits the mark? Because you never want to overspend. Overspend is really, really difficult. Underspend is exactly the same problem. I mean, if you invest, then invest the right kind of money. So I felt that from a methodology standpoint, I find that really, really interesting. And I would have loved to dive deeper into that as well. How exactly, I mean, there is a lot of writing, of course, on this. That I found was one of the most interesting parts, actually, in the discussion.
Hey, Jonathan, you mentioned that startups often feel sort of left out of the jobs you've done conversation. Another huge audience that feels left out are B2B marketers and B2B innovators. And you could have a massive company, $10 billion, $30 billion company, and you would think, wow, they must have really, they're doing lots of research, but when you look, they're often not. You often find but it's because, like, if I'm a product manager for a particular textile, let's say fabric, well, the total market for that fabric might be $15 million. And, so a pretty small number, and then maybe my share of it, maybe if I have a dominant market share, maybe then I'm selling $5 million, which for a $30 billion company is not that big a deal. So you're not going to spend $1 million of research to move your market share, move it 10%. It's just the numbers don't make sense. So what does that mean? That means the B2B marketers often have to do the work themselves. They have to do the interviews themselves. They have to do the quantitative themselves. And that's where new product blueprinting fills that space for folks. And actually, Jonathan, this would, even though I'm describing it in a B2B context, this would work excellent in a startup situation as well. Why? Because what's common about it is you've got limited budgets, you've got limited time, you've got somebody pressing you to move quickly. And to your point, Jan, if back to my fabric scenario, let's say it's for tents. We sell this fabric to tents. That's a B2B application. And, our customers say, well, they want it to be more waterproof. I mean, and we could write waterproofness as an outcome. Yeah. We can talk through that. We can get Lance on the phone. He's great with words. He can help us to write the words for that. But then it comes to how waterproof. It turns out, like, in an absolute sense, nothing is waterproof, because with enough pressure, water penetrates anything. So it's waterproof. It's not like, yes, it is, no, it's not. Like, there's a continuum, and there's metrics, and how do you measure waterproofness? And what level of waterproofness for our tents is barely acceptable? And what's those numbers? And what level of waterproofness, like our tent users, be perfectly satisfied? Well, that gives us a nice range. We know we need to be between. We know we can't go beneath that barely satisfied. And if we go past the perfectly satisfied and we add cost to it, we're destroying value. So that's what's great about, under the surface, You say, what's different about new product blueprinting is for other jobs to be done or voice of customer methods? I think it's that a lot of us, we sort of avoid these questions because we just do. For whatever reason, most jobs are done practitioners sort of stay out of the performance numbers. But then you've got an engineer there. It's like, well, how waterproof is it going to be? Well, new product blueprinting answers that question. And Jonathan, I was just reflecting when you're talking about startups. It wasn't creative with startups in mind, but I feel like it probably would have a lot of usefulness in a startup market or startup folks with limited budgets, but you still want to do some work and you still want to have some numbers to take to your investors and whatnot. I think that would be also a good usefulness for that.
Yeah, and also one thing I really liked about Dan is he's I mean a teacher. He's someone who likes to transmit knowledge, and I think even this seeps into the philosophy of the AIM Institute. I mean, you'll know better than I do, Scott, of course, but I think part of the contrary to many consultants, he will or external research firms who will, where the incentive is to keep the knowledge for yourself and so that the clients always come back. I think what I recall is really that the idea is to teach people how to conduct their own research. And I think for B2B firms, it was really important for him that they can do it themselves. And I think this resonates also with, we also discussed this a bit in the episode, that he homeschooled his children, and so he also wrote a book on that and how to educate. So I think education and transmitting knowledge and know-how is really part of him, from what I gathered, and I really like that as again from a value standpoint and from the use of it.
Yeah, I think that's so important. Again, a lot of us get so excited about the innovation process and this and that. We get all about the process and what about emotional job? We just get right into the thing.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, to get a company, to get people to adopt it and to use it, it's a different job, if you will. I mean, it's about helping them to feel good about themselves and to get started and to get out there. There's how do you take somebody that's intimidated, like, oh, I don't really want. They're not going to say this, but essentially they're scared to interview customers. Basically, they're intimidated.
That's exactly it.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
So how do you give them the confidence and to really a pat on the back at times and say, hey, you can do it. And if you're for leaders of big companies out there, you've probably hired lots of trainers, and a lot of times that training becomes a book it becomes a big binder on the shelf. Well, we got Six Sigma training last year. We got fire safety. It's like we got the fire safety training last year. It's like no different. We're not doing anything different. It's because of it. And so Dan brings a real kindness to it and a real empathy. And his mission is to help people, to give them what they need to do the work on their own. Part of it, of course, is understanding the process, but also he's an encourager. And also, and another thing, I guess the third leg of this stool would be making sure they have the tools they need. Like if something's difficult, well, can we create a tool for that? Can we create a template for that? And most of that within blueprinting is all around Blueprinter software, which is a sort of end-to-end tool. And by the way, I'll say this: with Blueprinter just has a new survey function. I feel like I don't want to go into commercial mode here, but there's a survey function within that. But again, why is that significant? It's because Dan is looking at what do these B2B marketers need, what are they struggling with? Oh, they don't have any way to survey their customers, and to use Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey. How does that you're asking them to figure out something else? How can we build this into the software that's like super, super easy to use?
It's very nice. I feel like, I mean, I have to bring this in. I think it's a wisdom he also took. Probably it was around there anyway, but I remember this vividly. And it really shows to where kind of his wisdom goes. So I mean, the sentence that I love this. At one point, we were talking about how to conduct an interview and what's your kind of stance if you do this actually, and it was a lot about this. Okay, taking yourself back and I think you can feel this also in the way he probably then teaches and gives. So taking yourself back and giving the other person the stage basically, and so this attitude that you need to have. And the sentence then he brought up, I love this. He said, "But this makes me think of." As a young man, I was worried about what others think about me. As a middle-aged man, I learned not to worry too much about it. And as an old man, I realized they weren't thinking about me anyways. So that for me was like the perfect wisdom. And now as a kind of young man, somehow young man, I'll try to take that with me.
Yeah, but Dan's a great teacher, and having sat in his classes a lot and watched him teach, he's a beloved teacher, I might even say. So if you need some B2B training, voice of the customer, reach out to Dan, or you can reach out to me. And with that, let's transition to be at Walther. And I loved the model there at his company, Venbridge. Frame, discover, spin, and develop. Now, it's actually this is sort of a coincidence, but a similar theme that we were talking about with Dan with Dan Adams is that, you know, he doesn't just stop at understanding the needs. It's like, now what are the numbers we need to hit? In a similar way, Biot with Venbridge doesn't stop at, all right, we've got a prioritized list of customer needs. You know, good
Off
luck.
you go.
I can't wait to hear about the good stuff. It's literally just two of the steps. And the degree that he's spinning new ideas to growth, that, you know, we need to stay involved. We need to help you understand the opportunities within this data. We need to share with you also. So we've got the quantitative data, but we did these interviews. We need to help color this with what we saw in qualitative, give you an additional depth of what's behind these numbers. Again, so it's not just, you don't want the research, you don't want training to be a binder on the shelf. Just as bad, you don't want your research project just to be a binder on the shelf. And so he stays with his clients and helps them to come up with new ideas, generate ideas, sharing what they've learned, and actually develop them. That was one of the big, that was process-wise, that was a huge thing. Yeah. But I really found Biot's origin story interesting as well, in that he learned a lot of these techniques initially with P&G, and like, we got really good training. And immediately I was like, do you know Min Basadur? Somebody else we'll talk about, who contributed to P&G's method. So I thought that was maybe it's just a coincidence, but here we had two of our guests that really cut their teeth and learned innovation initially working for P&G. Maybe it's still a good place to learn innovation. I don't know.
Yeah. So I mean, Beat is the first person, the real person that I had contact with in the jobs to be done space. I remember searching on LinkedIn, typing jobs to be done. I think it was 2015 or something, and I fell on his name, and so maybe a bit later. I don't remember exactly which year, but it was some time ago. And he's one of these guys who's been there really from the very beginning. I mean, he's followed the whole development. He's super knowledgeable about the whole space, extremely clear. A bit like a Tony Ulwick. He really, is extremely clear on his approach and why he does what he does. And so it's always a pleasure to talk with these kinds of people, because they've thought about the questions, so they'll have a really nice answer. And I think also for people who are maybe interested in learning more about jobs to be done, I think this is an interesting episode to listen to. I also think what's interesting, you touched on this, Scott, is the fact that Beat comes from marketing. And this is actually also where how I got into the jobs to be done space. This is also, I think jobs to be done is we always talk about its use in innovation, but it's extremely powerful it's an extremely powerful way of thinking for marketing. And I mean, all these things obviously are connected. You're obviously selling a product in marketing that another part of your company has developed, and so there's a connection between these two spaces, and I think Jobs to be Done really is that connection between marketing and the let's say development or innovation or the development of the product side of things. And Bert really brings that knowledge and that vision. And I think it's not for nothing that he's one of the proponents. I mean, other people have proposed this idea too, but this idea of the hierarchy of jobs and on how you can talk about a higher level jobs. And I think this really fits in well with the communication marketing also. So an interesting angle also on the space.
I think the way, I mean, I've now known him for 10 years plus or so. And he, I mean, he's the guy, and I love this about him. He reads something somewhere or makes an experience in a project, and it immediately gets translated into the next version of the approach. So it's like, we're talking now internally, we're saying, okay, we're at Ventbridge 4.0. So kind of at version 4.0, and we're talking now about what is 5.0. So he's constantly developing his things, and he's intellectually extremely curious. And I think it was last week or so where he put exactly what you're describing. So this marketing angle to me in a way that I think I'll never forget. I mean, probably for people at P&G, that's obvious, but the way he phrased it, it was saying, hey, well, I worked for, I think he was in Pampers. Okay, Pampers is maybe a different thing, but very exchangeable things. And he said, well, every day my question was, how do I make the exchangeable unique? How do you do this? If you have an exchangeable, yes, okay, Pampers had kind of a technological advantage. How do you, exactly, you are in the commodity space, but how do you make that unique? And there is the only thing that really is powerful there is the consumer insight in the broadest sense. And that's where he really is coming from. So the consumer insights, and then he really latched onto the Jobs to be Done approach, because it's one of those, it's probably one of the most unique ones that gives exactly those granular insights that you need in order then to make to really have an angle or a lever to make things differentiate that are exchangeable otherwise. So I think that is kind of, so yeah. And well, we'll see in a year or two, Ventbridge 5.0, we'll see what it looks like. Probably Frame and Discover is going to stay. I'm not sure about the other ones. We're now talking about Frame, Discover, Spin, and Scale, but that's a different thing. So,
Well, he's continuing to learn and add to and adjust. I mean, that's fantastic. There's a lot of other folks that sort of, they write the book and whatever, and it sort of becomes their limitation, like essentially the work they've done before.
Yeah.
And so that's I look forward to seeing what. I think I actually asked this in the conversation. What does the next generation look like? So I look forward to. I'm sure you do too. I'll see what that's going to be.
Let's see. Well, somebody who's also always changing. I think he even wore the T-shirt, wasn't it? It was like always. Well, I think the T-shirts is always run a changing system or something like that.
I think that's the next guest on our list, Jan.
That's Jan Schmiedgen, right? So, I mean, I know him. He's a design thinker in the broadest sense. Probably he wouldn't like me calling him that, but that's how I have kind of having him in his memory. He is one of the partners at Codify, and they're a lot about organizational structure. So how can you organize the structure of an organization in a way such that innovation actually occurs, so that it actually has a possibility to actually realize and materialize in the end. He uses design thinking for that, but not entirely or not solely design thinking. He was our connection also then to the HBI Institute, so the D school in Berlin, where they developed the methodology and applied as well. And I mean, I think I called him this Duracell bunny kind of energy people, and he really is. I mean, I just recently was in Berlin and I met him, and he could talk about, I mean, hours with him about anything, business, innovation, design thinking, whatever. So he is extremely knowledgeable. I think what I mainly took from him is this challenge really of the organizational structure. I mean, he now is specializing more and more in these. He said it so nicely, I think, in the podcast, the German Mittelstand. So like the German small businesses, smaller to medium large businesses, and they probably very often have an organizational structure that is not suitable for innovation. A lot of that has changed in the larger organizations. We can discuss it as well, but I think even there, and that's, I think, what I really took with him. Very often we have to find ways in our work, like how can you work around the organizational structure? How do you need to kind of bring your stuff into so it fits the organizational structure? And he's really about purposely designing that organizational structure. One of the nicest things I still remember, and I that's also one of the things I'm stealing from all of my guests. Sure, that just is a warning. But the good stuff I just steal. And one of the things I stole was where he said, well, at the beginning of each project, he has this kind of lever, or I don't know exactly how he called it, but where he said, okay, what do you want? Do you rather want innovators, or do you want to create innovators, or do you want to create innovations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And for me, the clarity it brought was not just, well, of course, that distinction is there, but having that discussion in a transparent way and say, okay, tell me now, there's innovators on the one hand, and there's innovations on the other hand. Where do you want us to put the focus? Because very often that isn't clear, or people want both, or they say they want one thing, and then you realize a month in they want the other. So, and that's certainly something I'm going to steal.
Or you've got half a dozen people. Some of them want one, some of them want the other, but they're not even aware. So, well, by the way, something back to Biot, the big part I love about your process is the business intention, getting the business intention. You know, so you have 6 people, they might answer it differently. Yeah. And with, do you want innovators? Do you want to create innovators or innovations? The 6 people might also answer that differently.
Yeah.
That was, I thought that was a big question.
What I really took away from Jan's episode is something which I think most designers will feel is quite obvious, but people who are in the more jobs to be done space might not see it so obvious. I could be wrong, but for me, it definitely wasn't so much the case. So I think it's quite well explained. He's super quotable also. I actually wrote down tons of his quotes after the episode, but the quote that expresses this idea that I want to explain is, "We build to think." And I'm not sure it's a quote from him, but he definitely said that in the episode, and that's for me something that was really a very interesting insight, and still something I'm kind of looking at. Jobs to be done, there's this idea that you output this jobs to be done analysis, and there you have established the problem, and then development comes in, and the development team comes in, and they'll basically instantiate they'll create a solution for the problem you have laid out. And a lot of pushback that is made against that from designers, and I think that there is a point there, and is this idea that it's you actually understand the problem as you build the solution. So there's this kind of feedback, this continuous feedback between understanding the problem and creating the solution, and they both emerge somewhat in parallel. And I thought that was a really powerful idea, and something that I've come across a few times after that, and that is really something that's stuck with me.
Yeah, that's true. Now that you mention it, he explicitly said that they're moving kind of problem and solution at the same time. Exactly. Me from the outside, my initial reaction would be, well, you're confusing problem and solution space. But I think kind of they would do this intentionally, kind of this co-development of problem.
Exactly, that's the word he used. Yeah.
So, and that's
co-evolving a problem and a solution.
That
was another one of his quotes. Exactly.
Yeah. And I think that is probably there is these that reminds me a lot of Ronan of Ronan and his wife, how they Ronan and Jane, how they would also frame their approach. And I think there is this part of, well, thinking through building that I'm not that kind of guy. I'm not that kind of person. Maybe I could be. I don't know. But there are some who learn and think in that way, and certainly Jan goes into this. He's always this. When I was in Berlin, we stumbled upon a question, and I would be the guy. Okay, let's think this through. And he said, I don't know. I need to build stuff, and then he kind of built a mini website to see if it works. I mean, that's how they approach things.
Well, before as we wrap up, Jan again, what was his T-shirt said?
Always run a changing system.
Always run a changing system.
I think it's a play on like, never change a winning team, but he was always run a changing system.
I think it's like never change a running system was the
yeah.
And then his was always change.
No, always run a changing system.
Run a changing system.
I mean, it's beautiful.
Well, and also for those of you who watch it on watch the YouTube, he had some pretty cool effects when he was showing us pretty cool video effects. He's got some things I think
he is set up
that it's worth taking a look at. The other thing, well, Jan was in East Germany. That's which was kind of, I mean, that to me, I don't know. To me, that's just very interesting all by itself. I mean, growing up in, well, he would have grown up sort of. I'm not exactly sure how old he is, but probably after the wall came down, I would imagine. But what a different world that it'd be something so foreign to me. What that must have been like growing up in East Germany after the, becoming more westernized, if you will. And so I guess to keep with our international theme, we had Katerina Kozludzhova from Bulgaria, our only Bulgarian guest. And one of the things that was really interesting about Katerina is she came from the hospitality industry. I mean, she came to America, moved to Florida as a young person, started working for Marriott, went through their professional program, and then just started making observations that things that were not that great with the patient. Sorry, I'm doing medical projects these days with the customer experience that were not ideal. And then returned back home and just pursued a PhD, and now she's a professor of innovation and has really become quite a student. If you check out her on LinkedIn, you'll see she's very well read, very well engaged with jobs to be done, and especially outcome-driven innovation as the sort of the core of her system. But a quote I really appreciated of hers was that you're never really prepared or ready for your first product manager job. And I think as a former product manager, I think that's absolutely correct. You can go through all the training you want, but then you find yourself, you've got a team of engineers, you've got executives that are sort of looking to you for things. You've got the engineers want to know, what should we be building? What should the features be? And there's a lot of product managers that just start telling them, just start build this and that. But that's not what makes a good one. A good one's going to say, well, they're going to sort of question, well, who am I to answer these questions? Who am I to know this? I need to understand the customer needs. And that was something that she very quickly saw the need for, which we didn't get into a lot of this detail, but which I presume led to her investigation as to, well, how is this done? What is ODI? What is jobs to be done? But one thing, it's just interesting, all these folks that we have that get excited about innovation and just their different starting points.
Yeah. I mean, she had tons of great references. I mean, there were a lot of classic books that she mentioned that I hadn't necessarily read, so I really jotted them all down, and they're in my reading list. So it was a very fun episode for that, for great references on innovation books.
I remember I quoted her one of her very first papers, and she didn't like that I did that. So I'll say now she has a book out in innovation, but I think it's just in Bulgarian. Maybe there's a translation coming, but I don't know. I think it's just
Yeah.
called innovation, right?
Yeah, but you're right. Just in Bulgarian, so we gave her a little bit of a hard time about that. So maybe that'll we'll get that in English. But I thought this was a nice quote. Customers are not experts. When they ask for the solution, there's something missing, and there's just these common themes. But it's funny. It's like, I mean, for those of us deep in jobs to be done, that's intuitive, and it's like as I read that, it's not like there's new information that I didn't have before. But I really enjoy listening to the work, how other people come to this and how they phrase it, how they think about it. And I feel like I'm still learning something. I feel like I'm still learning something new. All the same, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's why it's so lovely to have so many different guests.
Yeah, and speaking of different guests, so the next episode we wanted to cover is the episode with Murat Gokar and Francesco Cardoletti. So it was, I think, the first episode where we had two guests on at the same time. So it was a bit of an experiment. Also, it was quite different because these were not necessarily in the innovation space per se or design space per se, but real entrepreneurs and with a tremendous practical experience in building ventures and building companies. And so I was very happy that we could actually get that side also of the story, because often I feel we can get lost in theory, and it's nice to be brought back to the ground a bit on, okay, what matters in the end. In the end, we are trying to build businesses. We are trying to sustain a living as a freelance, maybe, or whatever it is you're trying to do, or as a bigger company. Also, we have there are entrepreneurial considerations in bigger companies, and so I was really happy to have these two guys come on and talk about their experience. So Murat was extremely quotable, so it's quite an entertaining episode. So it's maybe not as structured. It's quite a free. We kind of jump around different spaces, but I think we cover some really important topics on and concerns on the entrepreneurial side. So dealing with mindset, dealing with the importance of passion, dealing with the fear of failure, and I think there were some really great nuggets in that episode. So, as I said, Murat is extremely quotable, and there was a few quotes I had that I quite like. So, never underestimate the power of experience. And another, he also some interesting assertions, which I actually kind of agree with, but it was quite blunt about it, which was quite entertaining. So all businesses are essentially the same thing, which I thought was also very interesting. What I thought was quite interesting about their approach, I listened to it again recently, and there's a big focus. One word that comes back often in the discussion is identifying gaps in the market. And as they are not theoreticians about this, but they are more on the ground, and this we maybe didn't get into exactly what these gaps were, what that means, but I think this is a word that really came back quite often. How do we identify gaps? And we talk about that in that show, and we also really focused on mindset. I get the feeling I'm repeating myself slightly. Do you guys have anything to add?
Well, I felt kind of the same thing. I mean, you really know that they were talking from experience. I think the beginning, they were talking about how they had they ran a business of bringing people to clubs or something like that in New York. Right. So it's really kind of, they have worked themselves down from the street level up kind of story there. And I really liked it. I mean, and as you said, he was really bummed. One thing where Murat was really bummed was just all businesses are essentially the same. I wouldn't have the experience to judge it, but I loved it how he put it out. I know it. I mean, he's now, I think, in pharma. I think
Exactly,
Gen
yeah.
or something like that is the company called.
Ideogen is the company Murat is at, and Francesco is working for Unilever. I think he heads
yeah,
out
exactly.
with Unilever,
He's managing kind
in the
of the
innovation
startup
space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I really liked that one where he was I mean, very blunt, very clear in their position, and also very open about, I think, when they actually failed, and we're quite open about sharing that failure is just part of being an entrepreneur, and how to deal with that, how to overcome that. I think when reality punches you in the face, I think he used an expression like that. So I think if you really are an entrepreneur and or looking for people who have made that experience, that's certainly a great episode to start with. I mean, they've kind of felt like they've seen it all.
They were fun too. They were just fun.
Yeah,
they're just happy, and they were.
You could feel that they're friends. Like
they could feel their friends. That definitely made it enjoyable.
Yeah. And an interesting combination also. Francesco seems to be a bit more calm and maybe more analytical in his way of seeing things, and Murat is really has enormous energy and extremely creative. I thought it had a really nice kind of energy together, also both of them. I also really like the point about so as I said, we discuss quite a lot of the concerns that entrepreneurs have, and there was also an interesting point about prioritization. How do you prioritize what you should be working on at what time? And I thought that was also quite useful. Maybe we can move on to the next episode.
Yeah. So speaking of entrepreneurs, we had another entrepreneur.
It's true.
Michele Hansen, who has a podcast, but also they have her and her husband. They have a software as a service company called GeoCodio.
Yeah.
But that's which was interesting in and of itself. But Michelle's the reason we really reached out to her, she wrote a fantastic book called Deploy Empathy, all about qualitative interviewing. And man, if it's interesting, I've actually been writing a book myself on qualitative interviewing. I'm sort of messing around with it. When I read her book, I was like, well, maybe I'll just need to shelve my project, because
when is that coming out? I want a date from you.
Well, it was hers was so good. It's like, well,
that's true.
Nobody needs mine anymore. I mean, maybe I'll do it anyway because I've already worked on it a bunch. But it's but really from A to Z, how do you do a qualitative interview?
Yeah.
But I mean, it's more than that. She talks about, well, how do you recruit people? How do you set things up? And her background is a lot more in product management, but for software. So you're gathering that insight and you're acting on it fairly soon, as opposed to also doing long quantitative studies as well. But she reminded me of Indi a lot, in that there was just a kindness to the approach, just a listening. I mean, we had her on the podcast, and then somewhere during the middle, she started asking us questions, and then we're just like answering them. And she was like all of a sudden, I don't know. I think I'd tell her anything if she started asking questions. She really has a knack of making it a safe place, and which I think that kindness and qualitative is really why she reminds me of Indi a lot. But one of the really interesting illustrations she had, well, there's a story she told that I thought was pretty good. I'll begin with that. And the story was when she was personally doing a project herself, and she was interviewing, it was in a financial industry, and she was interviewing older, I presume she was older people sort of in retirement or shortly after retirement, about their investments. And at the time she was a, young woman, barely, not much over 20, doing these interviews. And she noted that they would sort of talk down to her a little bit, but she didn't let that bother her at all. She completely embraced that need of her respondents to sort of, let me teach you about this. Let me tell you how this works, which is a little condescending, but she didn't let that bother her one bit. She embraced that beginner's mentality. And oh yeah, can you explain this to me? I don't really understand how this works. And then she got this amazing information. Now, how is that different than what most of us would do? Most of us, when we realize that somebody's sort of talking down a little bit, like our ego perks up. Like, no, I know things about investments. You would start to say things that completely shut down the learning or at least reduce it. And so, yeah, that was a big, really a big important, more than a nugget there. I mean, a principle. This you let the customer be the expert. If we start educating the customer, we're not learning anything. It's all about adopting that beginner's mind and really about getting your own ego out of the way. And her book is just delightful in that she thematically not only helps explain that sort of in theory, but gives you like very practical examples, that American pragmatism. She's an American. She lives in Denmark. She can sit next to it. But, here are some questions to ask. You can ask these questions. Here are some questions to ask there. And so she discusses, sort of why it's important to have that beginner's mind, but also her book and even with us, she gives very practical examples about, all right, step one, what do you do? Step two, what do you do? And I found that not only just very enjoyable, but I mean, hers is another book, man. Why did I I need to shelf my book? Because I sort of had the same idea in mind, something very practical. And that's really what her book is.
Yeah. And I'll go on.
No, I mean, I was going to say it's so this was quite a particular experience for me, this particular episode, because I didn't actually say that much, just simply because I felt the conversation was going so great that I couldn't really add anything that would improve on it, and I didn't really want to distort what was going on. And at some point, she focused her gaze on me and started asking questions, and it was really, I have to say, quite impressive. And I was just really following along, getting all the information in and learning a lot, because this is not an area that I'm so familiar with. So I was just really kind of a listener in a certain sense. I couldn't really get into the conversation myself. And suddenly I was brought in like this, and I could really feel this intent listening that she suddenly projected on me somehow, and it was an interesting experience.
That was a very powerful moment. I mean, you could really feel her. I mean, through all this digital mediated stuff, even through, I mean, you could feel her kind of interview power starting.
Yeah,
right. So it was a very nice experience, and I think. I mean, it goes back to something you mentioned before, Scott, where you said, well, many are, I mean, and then quite rightly so, scared of doing interviews. Maybe at the beginning, there's good reason to be scared. I mean, it's a very difficult situation. You don't know exactly how the person's going to react. You need to be very flexible, blah, blah. If you have that, then Deploy Empathy is one of the best books around, I think, to kind of work with that fear and kind of, because she has these very practical things as well of, okay, here's how an interview is going to run. You can train this with your family. Go out and ask them. So extremely practical tips on how you can basically train the interview situation in your everyday life with people you feel comfortable with. So it's a strong recommendation, exactly, if you have this, if you're looking at the first couple of interviews.
The image on the cover of her book, which is this rubber duck, is an example of this approach. It's just really quite practical. That you talk well. I mean, she explains it in the episode, which I encourage you to go and listen to. But many such examples, very pragmatic.
There is one, but she admitted this. I don't know if she admitted it during the podcast or afterwards, but she's kind of also infused, of course, by jobs to be done philosophy. And there's one thing I couldn't mention in the episode from the book that I would love to mention. So they have somewhere in there, there's a section where she explains why it's so important to be solution free, or why it is hard for customers to come up with solutions. And there's a section in there, and I still have it on my screen. That's why I have a screenshot of that. So I think it was GeoCodio she's talking about. So the product, the software that they have. And they had this kind of survey feedback questionnaire. And one of the questions in there was just, what can we do to improve? What can we do better? Basically asking customer solutions, like what ideas for solutions. And then she said, but we didn't really get a lot of actionable feedback. I realized that was because we were basically asking our customers to do our work for us. More than 80% of customers left the field blank. Garbage question, garbage back. And I mean, if anything proves kind of the hard fact data that why jobs to be done is such a valuable approach, is exactly that one. You can't ask them, it's not their job to come up with the solution. That's your job. They're experts for their problems.
So one of the things about, Jonathan, you mentioned that the duck story, and I found that to be very entertaining as well. And it was, I don't know if it was from her husband, who's a software engineer, but it was somebody she knew that was a coder. And right. It went like this: if somebody's trying to understand something, they would have a rubber duck on their desk, and they would try to explain it, whatever this thing was, explain it to the rubber duck. And something in that process of internalizing it and speaking to it helped them to better understand whatever this thing was that they were trying to sort through. And I'll share this with you. After our conversation with them, I was at the beach, and I was out walking, and I saw a little rubber duck in somebody hit on their dashboard. They had like rubber ducks all across it. I couldn't help myself, so I took a picture and I sent it to Michele. I guess via Twitter or something, and she sent me a nice response back. And she was actually at a beach not that far from me. She lives in Denmark now, so yeah, that was sort of funny, but I think I'll continue doing that as I find rubber ducks in strange places. Put them on Twitter. What a fun little emblem to have. Yeah.
I think she gave a speech that basically I want to recommend as well on this whole Ford quote, like if I had asked my customers, I would only get faster horses, kind of thing. She has an awesome speech where she basically destroys the quote and the hundreds of different ways you misunderstand it. And there she is on, that's why I thought of it, on the stage with a t-shirt, and there's a rubber duck. Yeah. So that tells you quite something about the importance of images and branding and all that kind of thing.
For sure.
Which in a very cheesy way leads over, of course, to images and pictures, to Lindsay Zaltman, to our next guest kind of on the list. So I mean, the importance of images, pictures, and especially metaphors, I think that is what Lindsay Zaltman was all about. He is the son of the founder, or one of the co-founders of, I think it's Olsen Zaltman. So these are the two founders, and it's a wholly, completely new, for me at least, approach to qualitative research, and which is called ZMET. So ZMET is the kind of the abbreviation, and it's the Zaltman metaphor elicitation technique. Now I hope that was correct, but I think that's what ZMET is. So the purpose and the goal of this is to understand the deep metaphors and the unconscious thinking of your customers that they apply either in connection to your solution or to your brand, or just in general how they think and speak about the market you're in. And they use different techniques. I think one of them is really co-creating kind of a picture almost, or they ask people to bring stuff with them to an actual interview, and then from there develop an understanding of what are they use the expression deep metaphor. What are the deep metaphors customer use when they think about your product, your brand, or your solution? So there was this distinction between surface metaphors, which I think he said that at least 5 to 6 of those metaphors, we just use them in our everyday speech per minute. So there's a huge amount of these surface metaphors, and in their exploration techniques, they figure out and reduce it down to a couple of those deeper metaphors. I think there's 15 or 17, something like that. And they have discussions about how many, but there's like 15 or 17 of these deeper metaphors, which are things like balance, journey, all that kind of different things, like almost universally human, deep metaphors, ways of unconsciously thinking about stuff. And I found it a really insightful and interesting new approach for me. How you can actually get out something from your customers that they might not even be so certain about. There's this whole discussion, of course, about latent needs and all that kind of stuff, and what is there, but it's kind of tapping into a part of the brain that might not even be that clear to the participant in the interview themselves. So that I found that a really interesting, fresh approach. There's a quote that I really stuck with me. I think it was his father that said the quote, but he repeated it also, I think, in the podcast. And I think the method that they bring, so this Z-Met methodology about deep metaphors that they bring to the table, is really a reflection of that quote. And the quote is, if you trust the people you want to understand, they repay that trust with insights. And I found this to be 100% true. I mean, it's really this trusting the other person, giving them the lead in a certain sense and the space to be able to share their thinking and kind of co-create or develop that understanding during the time you have with them. It's just you get so much more out of them, and the insights that you get are so valuable. And I think there is also, maybe that goes back, well, that's a different thing, but still I want to mention this. So it's also very different reading a report about the customer interview and actually listening the customer actually speak. That is just such an invaluable source. And again, I think like Indi in the beginning, the Lindsay Zaltman, or that technique is heavy on the qualitative side. And I think they have a couple of quantitative parts, if I'm not mistaken, or ways of quantifying things, but it's a heavily qualitative thing, but a really new, fresh approach to tap on this unconscious, kind of thing. So I really enjoyed it, and all this discussion about what is a metaphor and how can you use that then later on for communication and even innovation. So there was a discussion about why a Porsche expresses the metaphor of masculinity and all that kinds of. So I really liked it because it was a kind of a new perspective on things.
Yeah, well, I think the adjective that comes to mind for me is it's a fresh. I think you use the same word. It's a fresh approach, which is a metaphor in itself.
That's true, right?
and that's really what I felt, because it's something, it seems obvious in hindsight, but I'd never really thought of myself. I never really thought about metaphors in the context of innovation. I mean, I think obviously in the context of let's say advertising and marketing, I think there's something more natural to do. But in the context of innovation, I'd never really put those two things together. And I found it was very enlightening, and it's the kind of episode you can listen to, and it'll jolt your brain slightly and make you generate new ideas, and for me that was really what happened to me as we were talking to Lindsay, that I had lots of ideas and making new connections, things I'd never really thought of before. And for me also, what was quite interesting is something we talk about a lot is it comes back quite often, a bit like a leitmotif, is that there are no latent needs, or that people know what they want, basically, that they know why they do things. And this kind of really totally reversed this perspective. You talked about this, Jan, also. I think at some point you said something like 95% of human thought is unconscious. And yeah, it did make me think about that, so okay, 95%, but is it the part of the thought that generates decisions? How does it influence decisions? How important is it? Is it all of decisions? So yeah, just an opening up of questions for me in this episode.
It is funny though. I think, just like you said, you used the word fresh. One of the big areas of awareness he brought was how integrated metaphors are into everything we say. We're just, we just say them constantly, becomes part of speech. And then it brings all these questions like, what's the difference in a metaphor and a cliche? I mean, these sort of things come to mind, you know. But I think the thing we all sort of found interesting was this idea that they have this sort of universal set of metaphors. And we didn't really get into that, but that's something I would have loved to understand. What are those? What is that set? And even internally in their company, there was some disagreement, and I forget the numbers. Some think they're 12, some think they're 16, some think there's 20. I could I could be way off by an order.
I think in the book there are 7, and then
so
he mentioned they extended the number, I think.
So not too far off, but I think that's great that they continue to have that conversation, because we're using the limitations of language. But I guess with a metaphor brings some other meaning behind it, right? Fresh, just like so the one Jonathan just used by accident. You know, so there's food that goes bad. I mean, I don't want to go down the road of what the metaphor. But we say them all the time. We don't think about it, but there's some deeper meaning behind it. That's almost like a shortcut in language. It's like this word. It's funny. We started out talking about how when words translate from one language to another, there's often something lost. If you try to explain a metaphor, it's like explaining a joke. It's like explaining a joke is also not very funny anymore. Something also is lost. And you know, if you're a hardcore jobs be done person, which I suppose I am, you know, you might think that I would take some big issue with his statement that, you know, people don't know what they want and whatnot. But to me, I look at it as one of the things that's just not understood really is really how the brain thinks, how it makes decisions, and what's going on in there. So I look at that challenge not as a threat, but as a, hey, what's behind that? What's going on? You know, and in my personal development, the things I personally want to understand better. And I've got a position on things like that for product development, for projects, but you know, I'm not satisfied. I feel like that's something that could be understood a lot more. And this idea of metaphors is probably maybe is the biggest challenge to our jobs done thinking, if you will. Now, I think if we got into it, I don't think it doesn't threaten it, but I think it's worth diving into, and it could really help to better understand, because what you want to do, you want to solve a problem in a meaningful way, so that when they go to buy a product, they say, hey, that solves my problem. That's sort of where you want to get to. I'm making a conscious decision to buy this thing because this thing makes my life better by solving this problem. And so when they get to that, you want to be able to predict what they're going to do. But what are all the mechanisms they do, and their awareness of the problem, and at what levels, and how well can they connect the problem to this solution that you're offering? So I feel like there's a lot still to be understood. And I absolutely welcome this idea of metaphors as a way to challenge my own thinking and to improve on it.
I like how you phrased it. I feel exactly the same way. I have so for me, my suspicion is, I think there is I sort of don't really buy into the discussion about emotional jobs. We don't have to get into that discussion now. There is a risk that we're going to do this anyway, but I think there is a little bit of that's a bit vague or mushy, at least in the jobs to be done space. And I feel like something like that, what they're doing in there is at least there's much more clarity to that whole space. So I think the same as you. So I believe I'm always on the lookout of what are meaningful ways to enrich a jobs to be done perspective. I mean, we know jobs to be done is one of the tools that are out there, and it's just one of the tools. It does a great job at innovation and understanding and measuring unmet needs, but it does other things maybe not so well. So where can you find meaningful connections so it enriches your whole approach? I mean, that's what we want to get to, is exactly what you said, so that people buy and get products that are actually useful, and that they make the decision quicker. And so I feel like it could be a very inspiring exchange, kind of, that we need to develop. And by the way, so this is the thought I should have asked him at the start, or at the beginning, or somewhere at least in the whole thing. I mean, jobs to be done the expression people use a product to get a job done is a metaphor.
Yeah,
it is a metaphor.
That's right.
I mean, it's one way of speaking, or it gets the job done, or some. So that's a metaphor. And I would have wanted to know what deep metaphor, like what does this say about us talking about products and then in the metaphor of jobs to be done? What people hire a product and fire a product. That's metaphorical speech. So to what deep metaphor is that related? And I don't really know. So
yeah.
Yet I'm going to shoot him an email maybe or something.
That's a very good point.
Well, you know, all these sessions, they're like a good qualitative interview. They answer a lot of questions, and then they leave you with questions that you didn't even have when you started.
Yeah.
Right. You get a bunch of new questions. And so with that, you know, how my own personal journey into innovation really began when I took a course a long time ago. It's called Creative Problem Solving by Basadur. And I was an engineer at the time. I was a manufacturing engineer. Manufacturing engineer is a fantastic job. But Men's creative problem solving system, it was the first place I'd ever been exposed to the rules of brainstorming, reserve judgment for a season. All ideas are good ideas, and we're going to diverge. But then after a while, we're going to converge, and we're going to apply judgment. We're going to select the best ideas. And in between then, there's even a diverging and converging. What criteria should we use to select the best ideas? And really, that's the foundation of any innovation process.
Yeah.
You know, the double diamond that we hear is. It looks like a double diamond, or it's a double diamond, because at least you have one diamond where you have each time you diverge and converge, you add another diamond, so you could have multiple diamonds. But when I learned these things, it was like a part of my brain woke up that I didn't even know it was there. I'd never heard anything like this. I'd never seen anything like some kind of methodical process for solving problems. And the front end of it was interesting throughout. I'm describing, but the front end of it might even be the most interesting, in which what problem area should we solve? And back in Jobs Be Done, we'll get in this conversation of how high a project, or how big of a project, do we want to study the job of being at peace? Or do we want to study the job of mowing the lawn? Or do we want to study the job of repair your lawnmower? Those are all jobs, but they're not. But which one makes the most sense for us as an innovation team, as a company? Which one are we going to makes most sense for us to address? And Men had a tool, I guess you call it a tool, called Why What's Stopping, and which is say I want to mow the yard. So to get to a broader problem, you ask the question, why do you want to mow the yard? And you go to a level higher, I want to make my yard more beautiful. And then what's stopping you from mowing the yard? And you get all these root causes of challenges with mowing the yard. And so it was a great thrill to me for us to have Basadur on the podcast. Yeah. And really the podcast, in a lot of ways, I've said this, it's an excuse to reach out and connect with people and keep those connections, but then have these deeper conversations that you'd like to have. And Men has offered so much, and I've learned so much. He sort of, got me kick-started on this career I have, whatever it is. But just a couple of real tangible things out of our conversation with him. First of all, he's just amazing to talk to. He has a distinction of being our most seasoned guest, but he's just amazing to speak with. The importance of getting to a simple language. Like, can we strip the jargon out of it? Can we strip the technical language out of when we're trying to understand a customer problem? To what degree can we do that? But anyway, it was a great thrill to me personally to reconnect with Men. And I still, on my shelf, actually I can see in my video there, I do still have those binders from when I took his course. Jan and Jonathan, you guys are a lot younger than me. I don't even want to tell you how long ago I took the course. but I still have them up there, and I still refer to them. I'll be like, well, how does that why would stopping work? And I'll pull it and I'll thumb through my little workbook, and it's when you, for me, somebody like that, I'm just very appreciative for what I learned from him. But it was a great conversation in that we were able to discuss his origin story, which was also started at P&G, which is kind of fun. How he helped create a lot of their innovation processes. I don't know, Jan, it could be some of the stuff he created are things that were taught to Biot.
Somehow it diffused over later. Probably, yeah.
Everything we're only like 3 degrees apart, so that probably is true. Actually, if we were to take the time
it's now that we're talking about it. By the way, we had one of very good clients that we have here in Switzerland. The guy completely changed industries, and before he was in P&G, and then he kind of stumbled across us, and he said, I need to talk to those guys. So probably there's something in the P&G training kind of way that just naturally connects. I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah. I mean, Min was one. It's lovely to talk to. I mean, he's such a great storyteller. He has a wealth of experience, and I think he's one of the most senior, but it also felt like one of the most busy people that we had, kind of always working on different. I got 2 books writing, or so.
Yeah,
super busy. Like all of that energy still. So it was just an absolute pleasure to talk to, and I think his approach is that's the steps you need to do. That's how you need to work. So it was extremely enjoyable.
Yeah, great storyteller. I was I also to an extent that we were a bit worried at first, I think, when we started, because he just started telling all these stories and we actually didn't even have to ask that many questions. He just started telling his stories, which was pretty great. And he also was kind enough to send us a link prior to the the episode, which is his so he's developed this. They've developed this test, which is the test is called Scatterbrains, or is that the book? I think
that's the book.
That's the book. So the test, I forget the name.
Innovation types, like
Basadur
innovation types.
Innovation profiler, yeah.
Innovation profiler,
yeah. And you can find it on his a link to it on his website, and it was quite an interesting experience also for us. We all did the test and got some results which I think were pretty close to what we kind of expected. Is my understanding. What I was really impressed, I mean, I was really impressed also by the yes, he was I think the most senior guest we had, but extremely youthful in his curiosity and still really having so many projects, and just someone who's also been there for such a long time. He's seen all the evolutions. I saw also a great interview, paper interview that I had read also prior to our interview with him, with Van Patter, who's a designer, and he's just talking with these guys who are in the field, who are top-notch guys, and just killing it. And it was a great pleasure and honor to have him on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. And this avoidance of jargon, I think that is, if only that would be more widespread. I mean, that's where I feel like I connected most on a philosophical level. I think there's 2 kinds of philosophers: those who use those weird words that nobody understands, and I dislike that a lot, and those who really try to say what they mean or something like that and express it in clarity. And I think Min is one of those, kind of in that camp. I just want to, what do you mean? Yeah. You can hide behind jargon for years, to be honest, without really saying something. And then that's exactly the right fight. So
Yeah.
All right.
And so next guest we wanted to talk about is Gerry McGovern.
Gerry McGovern. We had that is something we either we need to kind of continue with that or we need to correct it next year. We have a kind of an Irish overhead. There is a lot of Irish seems to be
Right.
like a topic
I
as
think
well.
we need more.
Or maybe
Irish
we need
connection.
more. Yeah, probably we need more. So Gerry McGovern, he invented top tasks, which is a great approach to prioritize basically. So he's coming, where he's coming from is information structure. So how do you structure information in a way so that it best serves the people that need that information and need to work with that information? And that's an approach he then developed to answer that question. So this top tasks method is one that he created, and there is a book, Top Tasks How To, where he really explains in detail how you actually can do this. And he's worked with many different organizations, including the WHO, the Irish government as well, and some other big kind of names out there to structure information. But he also, of course, could use it for innovation. I think there is a deep connection between the top tasks and the jobs to be done approach. I think because it's really about, he makes that beautiful distinction between big and top tasks and tiny tasks, like tasks that are really important and tasks that are less important, and he has developed a way of prioritizing these, and then again structuring your website, for example, or whatever it is, so it suits the information needs best. And one of the things that stuck with me the most is how that prioritization approach, or figuring out what are the top tasks and then really putting that at the top of our focus, is how that all connects to battling waste. And I think that is something we do in innovation as well. So there's a lot of waste that is produced in different areas, by the way, in our whole life. So be it in the environmental sense or food waste or whatever, in the data space. So that was where he kind of very much put the focus on, that we produce so much data that in the end we don't use. But in a sense, you could also say that, for example, flops or just products that are never going to be used, or ideas that are just going to be shelved, in the same sense, there's also kind of is producing waste, and the reason behind that is a lack of prioritization. We don't know what the priorities are from the customer perspective, so we generate 100 different ideas, or maybe even 1,000. And I really like this topic that is kind of was in the whole speech from the beginning on, where he emphasized a lot the environmental aspect that he cares about. I think one of his last words was that all he's trying to do is being a good ancestor. So I like that a lot. This idea of I have a responsibility to whoever comes next, and this cutting through the noise, getting rid of everything that it's not important, and daring to make that decision, and creating the fact base to be able to make that decision. This is important. That is not important. That was what I really liked about the top task approach, and why I wanted him on the podcast. So
yeah, certainly seems to be a lot of similarities with other methods of prioritizing and whatnot. But again, it's nice to see a different technique and to see what's similar, what's different. And I feel like it's almost like a series of qualitative interviews. What's similar between the ones you just did? Oh, those things that are similar, that there must be something pretty thematic there. That's sort of like a rule or a law. And things that are different, oh, is that arbitrary? Is it just terminology? Or is something actually better than another? Or is it just like, there's different contexts are being used? It just I don't feel like we learn a lot by just patting ourselves on the back all the time that how great our process is. I think we learn it's what's nice about his top task is just different enough that it's sort of nice to sort of challenge some of the ways we do things.
Yeah.
But on a personal level, also, he was fantastic. Again, I'm for more Irish guests for sure. He was fantastic on a personal level, and it's pretty cool that here. I mean, he's pretty much retired at this point, but he's taken up some environmental causes to be, as you said, John. I'd forgotten that, to be a good ancestor. That is a nice quote.
Yeah.
he has extremely strong values, and he's very committed to these values, and I have tremendous respect for that. And what I found interesting was, and you touched upon this, Jan, is this: there is a thread between all his different writings, even though on the surface they appear to be talking about quite different things. So I think his most recent writing is more about ecology and so worldwide waste and how.
What a great title!
Yeah, it's a great title. Worldwide waste, about how basically we're wasting energy by in different ways on the web, storing all sorts of data that we don't need, etc. And there's actually a thread between the waste that there is in wasting people's time, wasting just the lack of efficiency of a badly organized website, and the waste, the real, let's say, concrete waste of energy, and it's a thread that goes through all of his writing. And another just small anecdote, which I thought was quite funny, there's a very kind of high profile, which I hope one day we might get on the show, that would be great, a high profile critic of Jobs to be Done, Jared Spool. And he actually recommends to read Top Tasks. So he recommends this book, which I feel has many parallels with Jobs to be Done, actually.
Usually when things appear to be greatly different, I found it's usually terminology. Usually somebody's using this word or that word, and even some of the conflicts amongst Jobs to be Done practitioners, that they're using words differently. I use the word job executor, somebody else uses something else. And so it doesn't take, so maybe back to men's sort of principles of getting to what the simplicity of words, but I don't know.
Getting lost in semantics.
We get lost in translation. We get lost in semantics. Yeah.
So the next guest we wanted to talk about is Giorgio Pauletto. And Giorgio Pauletto is head of innovation in a big public service company. So servicing the canton of Geneva in Switzerland with electricity, clean water, and telecommunication, different kind of public services. And I wanted to have him on the show for a similar reason that we invited Murat Gökar and Francesco Cardoletti, because this is someone who's really in the field, who's someone who's got a tremendous amount of experience, and who's actually working in a big company. And so there was two aspects, which was how do you foster innovation in a large company, and secondly, an interest of Giorgio's is future studies, or trying to analyze trends to see what's going to happen in the future, so you can plan your strategy. And so I think we can what I took out of it is he really emphasized, and I thought that was very interesting, because again, something that seems very simple in retrospect, but not something I would have necessarily put up there, but now I find it's actually very important. And I think even I recall Elon Musk talking about something similar, which is the importance of attention. So he emphasized on this quite a bit, on how important it is to focus on your everyday, just to be attentive to what's going on around you. And he talked about the concept of vujeda, which is an inversion of déjà vu, which the idea is that you take something that you've seen a lot of times, that you've seen many times before, and you try and look at it as an outsider, you look at it afresh, as if it was something new. And I think in terms of this, analyzing future trends. So there was, being attentive. There's looking at the fringes, so we talked a bit about that in the episode. Also, how the importance of fringes in terms of users, and also in terms of trends. What kind of trends? So fringe users, fringe trends. And we also talked about different techniques for, you can't predict the future, of course, but for kind of making models of what could be. There were a few quotes. I had fun on this one, finding some quotes from the Foundation trilogy, which I'm not going to bore you with now, but I quite enjoyed one famous quote, which is maybe or maybe not by William Gibson, which is, "The future is already here. It's just not uniformly distributed." And this was a quote by our guest, which I quite liked. I would have liked to explore maybe a bit further some I think there's an interesting theme that maybe we could have touched upon a bit more, which is when we're talking about design and innovation, we all know the importance of gathering needs and understanding our customers' needs, etc. And the future in many of these frameworks doesn't feature in that at all. So none of this kind of future studies is incorporated in our innovation. And I would have liked to understand how we can incorporate this better. So what are we doing when we're studying the future? Are we looking at future needs? What is it exactly we're doing? And how can we bring these two things together? I think that maybe we could have explored a bit more with our guest.
Yeah. I was certain, I think yesterday or something, I was certain somebody brought up the concept of Vujeda, but I couldn't tell. I wasn't sure who it was, and I think that's a great thing. So seeing what's it again? So seeing what's familiar with a new eye or something.
Yeah. So we talked about in this episode this idea of something you do every day, like paying for a car parking, or something kind of random like this, and just looking at being very attentive at everything that's going on. Okay, so you need to take your money out, put the card in, whatever the process is, and just really being conscious of what you're doing, and this as a source of inspiration for new ideas, for where you could make things better. And I do recall Elon Musk talking about something in similar terms, which it's worth what it's worth, but I mean, it's a big name, so I'll throw it out there.
It's just nice to know you've got innovation in government, where, let's face it, that's where customers don't have a lot of choices. You can't choose, I think I'm going to buy my electricity from this place today. And so that's, it's good to know that the governments are having some focus on innovation and hopefully improving the lives of their citizens, because again, they don't have a lot of choices, but maybe they probably do a better job of that in Switzerland than they do here.
The challenge we had on this episode was that there were quite a few different interesting angles, and I think what is interesting about innovation in government is precisely that you have different stakeholders to the ones you might have as a private company. So, and he actually, we discussed this in the episode, that there's not just the users and not just the typical stakeholders, but for example the environment and other stakeholders that are not necessarily taken into account.
And I feel like he was a great guy, also very conscious about how do you diffuse innovation within the organization? Like, how can you bring them along? How can you affect change? So I think, especially in like those heavy energy infrastructure governmental organizations, they thinking in 30, 40, 50 kind of years of, that's their cycle, right? Once you put in the gas things in, so to transport gas to the houses, they're in there for 40 years. So they're huge timelines. And I thought that it was really, really sensible and really thoughtful how he managed to bring the whole company along with the new approach, and we're trying different things. And I think he mentioned something along the lines of, yeah, it took me now 2.5 years to just get a couple of words in that now the company uses. So changing a tiny bit of language, changing a tiny bit of how we co-work. So I really liked how his approach of how you take the company along, kind of thing.
Yeah, the importance of creating a shared language, which is also a common theme, which we also, I think, Jim Kalbach and in his way also touches upon.
Yeah. All right. There was again Irish. They're all over the, or was it? No, he was Irish. So Tim Macarthur. I think so. So a service designer, and so nothing against Irish people, by the way. So I'm so sorry why I'm bringing this up, but he was a very experienced service designer. He co-founded the Service Design Network for Ireland. There's a couple of other of those networks that are out there, and I think I'm really recommending that you check those out. So these are all service designers coming from very different places. Tim works at a larger organization as well, bringing in service design. And me and him, we kind of got into discussions because he showed an interest in jobs development, but also had some reservations because he had more, I think he had a great appreciation of it, but also he had this much more systematic perspective. Like, how can we change? He wouldn't ask, for example, how can we, innovate a certain service that the doctor provides, but how can we reconfigure the healthcare system? Which is a huge question, but I think it's the right one, given the kind of healthcare systems that we need to live in. Scott, you know this inside out now, and I think there's, be it Switzerland, be it the US, I think they're broken anyway. So I was really intrigued by this systems perspective, by the perspective of how does also the system itself kind of affect the things that we try to do on a more granular level. And that was a really interesting discussion for me, because I'm not in those discussions. I even tend to almost consciously ignore these kind of things and just accept the system as such as a given. And that's my space where I can operate. And so what can I do in that kind of space? So I really liked how I think he came from a very concrete service design perspective, and it kind of got bigger. The questions got bigger and bigger, and he started to put different methods together to address those more system level questions. And that is certainly something I took along, which, yeah, as I said before, I tend to, even maybe to my own detriment, ignore it to a certain extent, at least in my project work, because I didn't have the feeling that you can influence those that much. So I tend to ignore those, but maybe that's not something we should do.
Yeah, so obviously, I mean, I really loved when we got to talk about a topic which I'm quite fond of, which is systems thinking, cybernetics, this kind of stuff. And I think, so we had a bit of a discussion around that. There's, I mean, this idea that you can, a mantra we hear a lot in, let's say, systemic design spaces, is the idea of dissolving problems, which I think was, rather than solving, you dissolve problems. And so instead of, for example, I mean, one typical example would be when people had horses, to come back to the Ford example, people had horses and a lot of horse manure on the streets, and people might try to solve the problem of horse manure by, you know, I don't know, different adding some kind of extension to the horse or whatever to gather it. But you can dissolve this problem in different ways. Well, you can maybe, well, obviously, if you have cars, then that is no longer a problem you need to solve, the question of manure. You have other problems coming up, but the manure is no longer a question. And you can also solve it by changing mindsets and having people walk more or something. So this is idea of finding leverage points in a system and dissolving the problem in this way.
That reminds me a lot of Sergei. And we'll talk about him later a bit, but I think that's a very engineering kind of approach to problems. Some I think.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right. So certainly one of our more charismatic guests was Mr. Joe. Mr. Joe
just the
was
name.
so fun. Oh man, it's easy to see how he could captivate an audience. He was just full of personality. But what the quote he had was that, and again, we're not. I keep saying we're not a Jobs We Done themed podcast. I don't know. Maybe we're in denial. Maybe we actually are.
Yeah.
Maybe we're trying to be. When we set this up, I mean, right off the bat, it was like one of our first. I don't know if it's rules, sort of a guiding principles. We're going to be agnostic. We're going to be, but I don't know. Our own interests just they keep
Can't
coming
deny
out.
it.
We'll do a better job being agnostic next year.
I think it's also our network, right? I mean, we
yeah, for sure.
But did you notice how he framed it? We'll do a better job at being agnostic. That's already.
Yeah.
We've lost already.
That's right. Well, one of my first bosses, he was I won't give his name. It was a long time ago, but he was really overweight, and he would fall asleep while you were talking to him, and he would say, and this was like my first job, and he would say, I mean, he was huge overweight. He would say, Scott, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Except the way I said that, he said it much slower than that. I just don't have the patience to say it quite as slow. And it's like, so anyway, we're going to have some good intentions, and we'll still end up in a good place next year. But the big thing I got from Mr. Joe is, well, as I was listening to him talk, I think the thing I enjoyed and the thing I learned, they're a little bit different. We'll start with what I learned, how he really used Jobs We Done to frame up challenges, to create a common language for product development, something that flows all the way through marketing and launch and even all the way through sales. And his quote was, Jobs We Done can be a unifying force across the business. But what I feel like I got out of that was something much more important and much in that, it's one thing to know, forget Jobs We Done or what process, Six Sigma or design thinking, whatever thing you're trying to communicate through the business. It's like, it's not enough just to sort of know what the process is. I mean, he's had so much enthusiasm and he brought so much energy. It's like, if I was bringing him in to I would bring him into my company in a second to talk to our executives, to talk to anybody, to help communicate the importance of this. And that's like, so really on a personal level, that's the thing I really took from Mr. Joe is, wow, that's something I can really adopt, that enthusiasm. And the other thing is that, it was clear that he's not going to hesitate to talk to people at any level of management, any level of leadership. There's zero intimidation there. He's going to go straight to the top, and he's going to be quite direct with them. And so there's sort of the information I learned, which I guess those are more or less things I probably already knew. So the thing I personally took away is that enthusiasm and sort of aggressiveness, but not aggressiveness in a bad way. Aggressiveness in enthusiasm is probably a better word.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, what's funny is that he's a complex person, because at the same time, someone who is very courageous enough to show also his vulnerable side.
Yes,
he shared a lot of his doubts. He shared about imposter syndrome, this kind of stuff, and I can see how he gains trust with people, because I think the point is not really about becoming a Superman or something like this, but it's about how do you manage yourself? How do you become a better person? How do you go beyond your fears? And he brings a level of energy, and you see he's constantly, I think, even in himself, managing these, maybe a negative force and a positive force, and so you can see it working out, and it's quite a high energy interview. He's high energy, and yeah, I really enjoyed talking to him, and I definitely think he'd be a great coach for any leader.
I really think so too. I mean, he is really this very human element, kind of. I mean, human fascination also, in the sense that he brought it. I think for me, there was one point as well where we talked about the mindset of abundance.
Exactly.
I think that was something that also stuck with me for quite some time. So like, and how that kind of connects to jobs to be done. So in a sense, that I think he brought this example of iPhone versus oh my god, what's the other one called? Well, the
Samsung?
an Android phone or whatever. Yeah, exactly. So we're kind of, if you have the focus on, well, I'm going to try to improve myself, and we're going to try to improve our products, and we're going to try to make kind of products that fit the needs of our customers better. Competition is, in a sense, of course, always in brackets, but in a sense is irrelevant. That's now where, and whatever they do and whatever products they put out, yes, nice, fine. But that's not what I care about. I believe in my kind of product. There is enough market for everybody. And my focus is somewhere completely else. And I'm not worried if competition launches a new product, because I know I'm doing the right thing. And that, I mean, if you can kind of install and instill that kind of confidence in an organization, or even in just, I'm imagine having a company with a C-level with that kind of confidence, and how that must trickle down, that force, that confidence that you just have in your own approach. So that I liked a lot.
Yeah. And I just want to reiterate what John said about vulnerability too. It's one thing to be up on stage and sort of have the facade, but he brings so much confidence to be like, I'm just sort of the man here, blah, 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 excited. Yeah. But he was very real with us.
Yeah.
And, it just seems like that's part of his secret. It's part of what makes him compelling, is he's just sort of honest and transparent.
Yeah.
It's an interesting person. Yeah.
I think he was, maybe it's on the podcast even, I don't know, but he was kind of the first who said, well, look, what's going to happen probably in 20 minutes or so, it's very likely to happen that my daughter's going to open up the door, she's going to come here, we're going to talk a little bit, and then and it was just, there was no, and there is no issue there is no problem there. And I mean,
yeah,
all the worries we went through when we started using more of these video tools was, oh my god, somebody's going to walk in, and he completely with it was just completely natural. And if she would have walked in and kind of just, then it would be completely fine.
Yeah.
So an extreme, kind of serenity, or I don't know. Yeah, it was really enjoyable.
So thanks, Mr. Joe. It was fantastic.
So the next guests we are going to talk about is again a duo, Ian Kerr and Jason Frasca. And man, I love those guys. I mean, I think if you want mind expansion and something similar to Lindsay Zaltman that'll jolt your thinking, jolt your brain, rewire your brain. Well, I can't recommend this episode enough. And generally, their writing, they have a great blog and emergentfutureslab.com. You can find them on LinkedIn. I mean, the message. I mean, they have so many interesting ideas. It's very deep. It's deep thinking. A lot of super well read. We veer nearly into the philosophical, but to come out on the other side also with some extremely practical advice.
If there are some folks we talked to that really stretched our way of thinking, I don't think anybody stretched it more than these two guys did. Just with this idea of, I'm sure I'm going to have this all wrong, but essentially there's no new thoughts, or where do things come from? It's like everything is built on something else. And man, they go really deep into this. I mean, they ask questions. I haven't even think to ask questions of the questions. I mean, I honestly have a hard time understanding it. It's something but I've been reading their writings on LinkedIn a lot lately, and they almost read like poems, like poetry. So these two, there is something there in their thinking that it's so outside of my normal way of thinking. I mean, my normal way is just, what's the problem? Let's come up with a solution. What's been done. They sort of really start at they're starting at a different place, and their thinking process, it goes a different way. And so that's one that I should probably listen to more myself. But I definitely have found my ways of looking at the world stretched more in this conversation than probably any other one.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ian is the guy, right? He's a kind of a fellow philosopher, if you so want.
That's right.
Right. So that's and I mean, I think I know. I mean, there's many different things that they coupled together in their approach, but one strong thinker is behind everything, and you can hear that in the words that they use is Gilles Deleuze. I mean, and that's, I mean, if there is any kind of thinker that is really different from a lot of what the world has seen in the past 2,500 years, it's that guy. So it's not surprising, Scott, that you're saying that they're coming from somewhere that's completely different, because that's really, I mean, that's if you really want to get confused, pick up a book by Gilles Deleuze. I mean, it's super interesting, but it's a very different world, and it takes some time. It depends on the book, but
what I love about these guys is that they bring up some themes that have come up quite a lot. Also, you hear quite a lot in the innovation and design space, such as embodied cognition, these kind of topics, anti-representationalism, so going against models in the head and all this, and I often feel somewhat confused when I read or listen to people talking about this, but these guys are so precise, I find, in their writing, that to me it makes sense. And I think this idea that the new cannot be conceptualized is just really such a, it kind of gets you at some point. You kind of think about it, you say, yeah, there's something to this. And they have this quote at some point in the podcast. They say, which is surprising to us as jobs to be done people, because they actually clearly say defining needs and wants comes after the disruptive innovation.
Yeah.
For them, the disruption happens, if you really want to do radical innovation, it happens before the process that we would typically start to do in a jobs to be done project. One thing I would have liked to explore a bit more with them, we kind of touched upon it a bit in the show, but I think we could talk about that more, is the framing of the problem. Is how do you actually frame what it is you're going to do as an innovator or designer? Because they have a lot of techniques, but a lot of it is based on this non-conceptualization. But at some point, a framing implies a conceptualization of some sort, and I would have liked to explore that a bit more with them. We did talk about it, but I mean, all in all, this is mind expanding stuff, and really can recommend it.
All right, let's transition to Sergei Ikovenko. Sergei is a trees master. I mean, trees, TRIZ, which, it's interesting. Trees is it's a problem-solving method developed by Heinrich Altschuler. And it's a very interesting story of how it was developed. We went into that story a bit in the discussion. But it was really, I don't know, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, it was something that was talked about a lot in new product development as this really sophisticated means to solve problems. And I won't say it's fallen out of favor. I just don't hear about it that much anymore. It's just maybe the circles I'm in. It used to be referred to a lot, and it was used a lot, like in automotive and people that make mechanical things. How do you solve mechanical problems? I mean, I don't know that that's exactly where it was, but that's just the people I heard talking about it were usually in automotive, or at least trying to solve mechanical problems. And I'm not going to pretend to be a trees expert, but I can tell you it's very interesting reading. A couple things. Just for example, just one quick example, and I'll probably have this wrong, but one of and by the way, trees is sort of like this. It's sort of this set of all these various tools. Maybe that's part of why it's hard to adopt. It's not like a process, step 1, step 2, step 3. Maybe there's some innovation to help with that. But one of the things it tracks is this sort of evolution of technologies. And so where something might initially be like just rigid, and then it goes from rigid to jointed. It goes from jointed to multi-jointed. It goes from multi-jointed to flexible. It goes from flexible to like liquid into a gas into a electromagnetic field. And so one of the examples to illustrate that is with weapons. So whatever, 10,000 years ago, or longer, than my weapon is my hand. I hit you with my hand, and then I get a rigid spear, and then I maybe have to power the spear. It becomes a bow and arrow, and fast forward, and we're dropping bombs. So, or maybe there's electromagnetic pulses, but that's just how different technologies improve over time. But the biggest thing probably it's known for is the contradiction matrix. How can something be strong and light or whatever? And that's Tris. But it was just as interesting to listen to Sergei, because Sergei was trained by Altshuler himself, who was a Russian. Altshuler was this Russian science fiction writer who got a job in the patent office and started noticing all these patterns of innovation. And so he developed his method, and Sergei, Altshuler was Sergei's Tris teacher. And so, so the best Tris experts in the world tend to be Russians. Everyone I've ever, almost every practitioner I've ever met, maybe except for one, was Russian. But Sergei was, his lineage from the person that invented it is one-to-one. He learned directly from him. And one of the more interesting things about that episode that I'd encourage you to listen is we talk about Altshuler itself, who, as a science fiction writer who didn't like the way things are going with the government, thought it was a good idea to write Stalin letters criticizing his approach, and he ended up they sent him to prison for that. But in that episode, you'll know we'll cover a couple things. Sergei will take us back into the history. I think I was asking about it. I was curious about it, about how Tris was developed with Altshuler, etc. And then we'll go into a little bit about the method and some of the tools. But then the undercurrent for me also, there's another metaphor in it. As you go through, is just listening to somebody teach about Tris who learned from this master who created it. To me, that's just sort of almost feels like, this has some historical, we're talking to somebody of some historical significance, at least if you're interested in innovation anyway. Yeah. So that was on a personal level, but I enjoyed as well.
Yeah. He's a very, very likable guy as well.
Yeah.
I mean, the stories that he brings, be it that short kind of, letter thing with Stalin is a brilliant story.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, Tris is this. I thought it's a this interesting mix between. It has that level of abstraction, so I think it kind of is. I'm also not an expert on this, but I think it has these kind of like 30 or 40 rules to apply if you're getting stuck, like change the aggregate state, or what if it was. What could you remove so the problem doesn't occur? Something like a set of rules or almost like maximes or general rules that you can follow. And I really liked how they have this. It's a level of abstraction, but you can immediately see how the practical use kind of thing. So it's that I thought was really interesting. So these different ways of I could really see an engineer. I mean, I'm not an engineer, but I can imagine it well in my mind, working on a problem, and then you're getting stuck. You don't know how else should I optimize that part of a machine, or what else can I do? And then you pick up Tris, and there's a set of rules, and maybe 33 helps you, and it kind of does the trick. Now I know how to. So I felt it was a really powerful thing, and I agree with you. It kind of has fallen. Maybe we just forgot about it. I mean, sometimes it just happens. If the people kind of disappeared or push it, then it gets forgotten. I think it unrightly so, to be honest.
Yeah, I think there's a lot there's a lot of things just hidden away as it's sort of gotten forgotten. And I think I think there's an opportunity for somebody to sort of become a champion again, but it probably, there's some questions like, well, what makes it difficult to communicate? I mean, one of the things I might suggest is it does seem to be sort of like, here's a lot of tools as opposed to a process 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But maybe it needs to be organized in some way. But I think that, but the point is the fact that it hasn't communicated or has lost energy should don't make any mistake. There's a lot of really powerful problem solving tools there within.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, so Trees is really a bag of conceptual tools to help solve problems. And I think in this episode, you really get, we described some of these tools, and you can immediately see how powerful they can be, because they can guide your thinking in solving problems. And what I was really happy about in this episode is that we also touch on a kind of new topic, a topic we've not really addressed on other episodes, or not as directly at least, which is this gap between, okay, we define the problem, and then how, once you've got the problem, do you actually design a solution, which is the part, of course, that Jobs to be Done doesn't address. Jobs to be Done will define a problem, and then, well, it's basically on the designer development team to basically find some kind of solution to the problem that's been defined. And Triz is on the solution side. It talks about how you can, and it's very conceptual. It's so it's obviously appealing to people like us, probably, I guess. Sergei was just such a brilliant storyteller and extremely clear explainer of these concepts. So I think you get a really nice overview of some core ideas in this episode, and I really enjoyed talking to him.
Yeah, for a quick overview, history and overview of Trees, you're probably not going to do much better than to grab that episode and check it out.
Yeah, for sure. And that brings us to our last guest that we're going to review, which was one of our most recent episode. And I think I will just give a few quotes out before saying who this guest is. So there is no such thing as latent needs. Everyone's trying to come up with solutions to satisfy needs, and we can't agree on what a need is. So these are some talking points that you've probably heard before, and from none other than Tony Ulwick, the creator of ODI, Outcome Driven Innovation, and one of the founding fathers of the Jobs to be Done framework. So I'm just so elated that we could get him on our little show. I mean, it's we're very, very grateful that he accepted to come and talk to us. And it was I think so. Many people know what Tony's about. Many people have heard him talk before. And what we tried to do in this episode is to go, of course, talk about the core concepts, but go beyond these concepts. And I think we were able to get into some interesting spaces with Tony. As I mentioned on LinkedIn, I find it difficult to. It's difficult to surprise him. It's nearly impossible because he's thought about everything so rigorously. Yes. He really, you can ask any question. He's heard it before 100 times. And to come up with something interesting, to get something new can be a challenge. But I think we did get into some interesting territory. With Tony, it was obviously much too short. We probably all could have gone on for a while. He couldn't do longer, but I think there's a lot of stuff we could still explore with him. For me, what was interesting is we really I mean, he really emphasized on this confusion, which or confusion is maybe too strong, but this mixing up of the innovation activities, what he calls innovation activities, it's his definitions, and what are development activities. And he makes this very clear distinction, which I think is not something entirely new, but also something that's it's quite interesting in context of the questions that were asked, that he kind of often came back to that distinction. Yeah. I would have liked to talk a bit more about some of the hot topics of contentious topics of jobs to be done, such as how can we apply jobs to be done to art? We talked about this, talking about Ruth Hartt at our first guest. I would have also liked to bring in a bit of the new, is it unthinkable? So the Kerr and Frasca perspective. Is it possible to do radical innovation using jobs to be done? So all these questions that I've had in my notepads for years now of, okay, what the hard questions of jobs to be done. I'd love to have an opportunity to talk to Tony again and really dive into these difficult questions. But really loved it, really happy and feel proud that we were us three able to get Tony. Well, mainly Scott, because you invited him, but it's really it was a really nice end to our year.
I was just gonna say there's a big thank you that we need to express to Scott. I don't know what magic you worked, but so
I've known Tony a long time. Tony's a friend, and when we began our little podcast project, that was what there's two things I imagined. I said, this is how to end the year. Let's have our last interview let's get Tony on at the very end, and then let's have this session. Let's have a year in review. Yeah. That I sort of thought that from the beginning. I wanted to wait. I wanted us to earn our stripes a little bit before asking him, so at least we have some, at least some measure of following. So he might imagine it has some benefit to him. But it's funny when I was sort of thinking about, when I was sort of creating our discussion guide, one of the things I was going to say is, as he's coming on for us to go, we're not worthy. The Wayne's World thing. He would have thought that was funny, but yeah, Jonathan, you're right. He's heard everything. You just got to give him the credit. I mean, how many people are using a jobs he done process that's not largely built on what he's created? I mean, it's a ton of people. I remember the confusion some almost 20 years ago now, when I'm taking these voice of customer classes and they're telling me about latent needs. They're telling me about unarticulated needs. And I'm like, I don't know any different. I'm just believing what I'm told. And then Tony there alone saying, there's no such thing. There's no such thing as a latent need. And I was like, what? And I'm being told to use this QFD process. And he's like, hey, there's all these problems in this QFD process. It's this, and this. I'm like, and everything where everything was confusing before, Tony brought clarity. And it was like, oh, wow, this. And all of the criticisms over the years, it's almost like, well, it's made it too clear. It can't be that simple. It can't be that easy. But now I've got some years under my belt of doing the process and new products. And now nobody, I mean, you might tell me how something can be improved or whatever, but what you can't tell me is that it doesn't work. You can't tell me it's not effective. Yeah. You can't tell me it's not helpful because I've used it. It's like you might as well tell me I'm not sitting here and I'm on Mars because it's like I've experienced it. And so with Tony, I mean, he might get tired of hearing me say this, but I can't help myself. If you hear me give a presentation, almost I'd say 100% of the time you hear me refer to Tony and express some appreciation. It's like it's all the time, and it's because he's earned it, and it's because I feel I'm very appreciative, and so I don't waste an opportunity to say that. And certainly, I don't remember everything I said in that conversation, but that certainly will be there. If you read my book, you'll come away from the same thing. You're not going to come away from that like, wow, Scott created all this stuff. You're like, no, Scott found all this stuff and 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 became a believer, really. And so, yeah, and it was that time went by so quickly. That time went by so quickly. We were supposed to be keeping it to an hour. We still into an hour and a half, and it was like it was. Yeah. I'm not out of all the. I mean, I loved all of them, but that one just felt like it went by the fastest. And I think it was because we just and to Jonathan's point, we almost feel like we just gotten started. Almost felt like, I mean, there's so much more we could have asked. And Jonathan asked fantastic questions. We didn't take it easy on him either. Jonathan asked some challenging questions, and I thought that's good, and that's as it should be. Yeah. And but also, Tony can be really funny. He's an entertaining person. He's great on the stage. He referred to, you might remember, we asked him the question that we sometimes end a session with, which is if we were going to do a movie at Innovation Conference, what movie would it be? And he sort of deferred on that. And he said, well, I remember you gave a presentation at our user conference. That was pretty good. We'll do that. We'll do that one. Well, that was awful nice of him to say. But I remember giving that presentation. It was at the University of Chicago in this little round theater. And I was as nervous as I've ever been in my life. I was absolute newbie in Jobs Be Done. I mean, I was getting started in it. And here I was going to give a presentation to all Strategens folks and all their clients and all these prospects here at the University of Chicago. And it did go over well. I think one reason is I was so nervous that came up, that all of a sudden that just turned into energy. And I remember one of the things I just said is almost a throwaway comment that everybody laughed at, is I was saying, well, when I grow up, I want to stand up on stage and be as cool as Tony is. When he's always in control. He's always so cool. And yeah, he's heard every question. He gives a very thoughtful and detailed answer to any question. And so if you're in this space, if you're in this Jobs Be Done space and things are confusing, wow, how much do you appreciate that clarity and a good answer? And it's not sidestepping it. And there's just, all of us in this space, owe a lot to him. But also, if you listen to that, he's funny. He's very entertaining in his own right, very generous with his time, certainly with us. And so that was, perfect way to cap off our first of many years of our Product Quest podcast here.
No, absolutely. I mean, I almost don't want to say anything. These were like perfect words to end. Okay, so I'm gonna just say it once. I mean, we're so used. We're all standing on the shoulders of giants here, and I think he is one of those, and it's just, I mean, the clarity, as you mentioned, and the language and the system he's worked out. It's I mean, my life would look very different without his work.
Yeah,
don't mean that in a good way. So
yeah, same.
And you also have a connection to Tony, which you describe in the episode. You have a loose connection.
Did I describe it in the? I think it was after.
You do.
That
so
let's
leave it. Let's leave it as a.
Yeah. Well, connection is a bit of an exaggeration, but my prior boss, he worked with Tony directly as well. So there's some line there, but I think Scott is like 100 times closer than that. No, but it's very enjoyable, and I mean that's just the go-to address. I actually, to be honest, I have this in my. So if you scroll down on my LinkedIn bio, I mean, because I think, I mean, the title of his book, the I think really the fundamental one, what customers want. That's the question.
Perfect title, by the way.
That's a perfect title, and I acknowledge this. I say this in the bio. That's the question that I've been struggling with on the professional side for the past 10 years. That's exactly the question, and it was an honor to have him. So,
well, guys, it was a great year one. It was fun. I enjoyed it. I look forward to everyone. And there's a couple episodes we had just us on there. Those were a lot of fun too. I look forward to doing some more of that, but let's see what year two holds for us.
Absolutely. And I by the way, I learned a lot also from you both. So it's not thanks to our guests, of course, but thanks you guys also for doing this. It was extremely enjoyable.
Well,
Yeah.
I'll throw it back at you. Same here. Very enjoyable and also formative experience.
Yeah, Jonathan, you always ask such good questions.
Yeah.
When you look down,
you're gonna
when you look
jinx it.
down
You're gonna
and you
jinx
start,
it.
I'm like, here we go. What is it?
He's sharpening his knife all
It's
the way
like
through
he's
and
getting
then
ready to go.
Well, that's the thing, because I kind of I probably talk a bit less, and I just kind of trying to think of you're kind of really doing the hard work of making the show move forward, and I just come in with the
I'll fill in the space. I'm just stalling for time.
me and
Well, that's
Scott
the
were
thing.
producing
But
hot air.
I'll see you look down, and I'm like, oh, here we go, because it's always such a fantastic, well thought through, very provocative question, and it's so with whoever it is, it's like, you know, it's very polite, but you know, you'll challenge them a little bit on the, or in a way that helps anybody listening to better understand. And so I really appreciate that. And Jan, I want an episode on Aristotle or something.
Yeah,
I want
that would be
you
great.
know, I feel like you're hiding. It's like you got this superpower and you're sort of hiding from us.
That's all a trick. That's all a trick, right? If I would show it, you would see that it's just hot air. So,
well, I doubt that. I'll say
let's do that.
Yeah, I absolutely want to do this. And both of you, it's just I appreciate your friendship, and this is a lot of fun. When I'll say back to one of our earlier ones it's one of our earlier conversations with Ronan, and I was describing something, I don't know, and he goes, "Oh, that's the power of being instead of doing. You should read Heidegger." And I was like,
"Oh yeah, right."
Like, yeah. so I immediately got some, started reading it, and I was it was like, whoo, over my head. It was like, wow, this is some dense stuff. I was like, he should have stopped with being versus doing, and don't do anything.
Don't tell. Yeah,
let's leave it right there. So I can't imagine, you know, as you've gotten into all these philosophers, and I'm sure, you know, you'll see connections. These are similar. These are different. So I don't even care if it has anything to do with innovation. I'd love to have that conversation. You can help me understand Heidegger, because I'm reading it's not going to get it for me.
I mean, you're the guy who wrote the book about the jobs to be done philosophy. And I mean, what else is there to fall in love with than
yeah. And which I want to also reiterate, and we talked about before knowing you, Scott. I knew Jan before, and we met you, Scott, through interviewing you on your book, actually. And I mean, we were both. I mean, for me, Statue in the Stone is still. I would even say. I don't want to embarrass you, but let's say it's one of the best books on jobs to be done.
Yes.
I'd say
embarrass me. Go ahead. Embarrass.
Well,
it's available on Amazon right now.
Exactly. Go and get it. It's a great book.
Review only if it's going to be a good one. If not, don't worry about it. But you know, it was one of the more impulsive things I've ever done. Was I just said, hey, let's start a podcast. When we talked, when we connected, it was just so easy. I just sort of fired off an email one day, and I'm so glad I did. It's been a lot of fun, guys. All right, Jan, you want to take us on home?
That's, I think, the perfect place to end it. So thanks so much to our listeners. And as always, that concludes today's Product Quest podcast. So please send any comments or ideas for future shows to productquestpodcast@gmail.com, and see you next year.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, that was fun. Wow, that took a while. That got a record for our
2.5 hours.
Got a record.
Is that 3.5 hours?
Was it 3.5 hours?